Right, good morning, honourable members.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Call on the chaplain to lead us in prayer.
God be merciful unto us and bless us, and show us the light of his countenance, and be merciful unto us.
That thy way may be known upon earth, thy saving health among all nations.
Let the people praise thee, O God. Yea, let all the people praise thee.
O let the nations rejoice and be glad, for thou shalt judge folks righteously, and govern the nations upon earth.
Let the people praise thee, O God. Let all the people praise thee.
Then shall the earth bring forth her increase, and God, even our own God, shall give us his blessing.
God shall bless us, and all the ends of the world shall fear him. The Lord be with you.
And with thy spirit.
Let us pray. Lord, have mercy upon us.
Christ, have mercy upon us.
Lord, have mercy upon us. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Give
Give
us
us this day our daily bread,
and
and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
and
Lead us not into temptation,
but
but deliver us from evil.
For
Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Lord of all the nations and friends of the poor, strengthen the members of the house and all who lead the nations of the world, a belief in the dignity of every human being, a belief in the values of justice, freedom and peace, that we may grow in respect and understanding of one another, and righteousness be established in the earth. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you all now and forevermore. Amen.
Amen. Chaplain, I can advise the House that leave has been granted to Mr. Wannenberg today, who's unwell. Turn to questions, and number one is in the hands of the Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for Infrastructure, following the resolution of Tynwald in November 2023, when the Department will call for evidence regarding the possible strategic reset of the Sea Services Agreement, what the likely scope and timing of any strategic reset are, and if you will make a statement.
On the Minister for Infrastructure to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wish to thank the member for his question. The Department began reviewing the Sea Services Agreement in mid-2023, and to ensure a comprehensive stakeholder representation, a cross-department working group was formed, including officers from the Department, DFE, DEFRA and Treasury. This group aimed to review the Sea Services Agreement through a strategic reset, focusing on key aspects that could be negotiated with the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company. Following the establishment of a select committee earlier this year to review the Sea Services Agreement and Treasury's shareholder status of the steam packet, the working group paused its activities to avoid duplicating efforts. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind this House that earlier this year I was selected in the other place to become a member of that select committee, and the committee's report is expected imminently, and it is not my place here to preview any of the findings. My department's working group had already had valuable discussions and gathered some useful information during 2023, and that information helped to inform the department's oral evidence, which was given to the committee on the 8th of May 2024. The department is now awaiting the publication of the Select Committee report and the subsequent debate and recommendations to understand how to move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On to question, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll come back to the compliance with standing orders of that interpretation by the Department. But has the Minister or the Department given a strategic reset notice to the steam packet of any proposed variation to the Sea Services Agreement? If so, what is the proposed variation? And if not, does the Minister agree that the 5-yearly strategic reset of the Sea Services Agreement needs to take place before end June 2025? And as not less than 6 months' notice in writing of the proposed variations is required, the Sea Services Agreement cannot be strategically reset now.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the information about whether we gave notice to the steam packet. However, I'm guessing because work had started that they would have been aware of that, and they certainly would have been aware of the timing. As to the other questions, I don't have that information with me.
Mr. Thomas, supplementary.
Thank you. That's very disappointing. So basically the Sea Services Agreement has a schedule, an Annex 10 and Schedule 13, Section 13 of the agreement, which is very specific about the change control procedure, and the Minister and the Department seem to be unaware of that change control procedure. Why did her department ignore the Tynwald resolution in November 2023, which required the Department of Infrastructure to call for evidence by June 2024 in respect to this possible strategic reset of the Sea Services Agreement? This is especially galling as Minister Crookall stated during that Tynwald debate just over a year ago that he was absolutely happy with that commitment, continuing, I am happy with that and more than happy to support, Mr. President. Basically, the amendment in January 2024 shouldn't have been allowed if it was contradictory to the November 2023 resolution, because it's in the same parliamentary sitting.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A formal call for evidence, I'm not sure did go out, and I think that the initial conversations had started. So I accept if the member says that we didn't follow the procedure, then we hadn't followed what was requested of us. However, I'm anticipating that once we have the Select Committee report and we see the findings of that we will be able to move forward on this.
Question, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I too have looked back at November 23 and the Hansard from Minister Crookall at the time, and supported by the former DOI Minister Thomas, undertaken to consult with the hauliers, customers and the general public around the possible strategic reset of sea services. Also said it would call for evidence from them and others about the costs and benefits of any proposals because of excuse me, cost and benefit of any proposals. So the Minister, I think, has just admitted that that hasn't happened. So what is the Minister going to do to rectify that?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I admitted I didn't know if it happened. Rather than it hadn't happened, I'm happy to go away and find out that information, and I can circulate it to members.
Dr Allinson, supplementary question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that the Steam Packing Company have been engaging with the Department since the beginning of this year, particularly in terms of the fleet strategy and the strategic reset which would be necessary to determine which vessels are kept as a backup vessel? Would she also agree with me that the work of the committee in terms of getting a huge range of feedback from users of the Steam Packet Company has amassed some very useful information going forward? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do indeed agree with my honourable colleague. The Steam Packet have been engaged not only with the department, but they've also been engaged with the committee as well, and there have been a number of changes that have come forward from that.
Supplementary, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the variations that have been agreed to the Sea Services Agreement, can they actually be achieved within a neutral cost envelope, or has the department additional costs that would be incurred by the company as a result of the variations?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware what variations have been made to the Sea Services Agreement, but I can undertake to find out.
Mr Thomas, supplementary.
Thank you very much. I would hope that no variations have been made to the Sea Services Agreement until the Sea Services Agreement itself is complied with. Basically, to remind the Honourable Minister, the changeable provisions cover vessels, services, capacity, the marketing plan, the IT requirement, the fares, the charges, the fuel surcharge, rebates and the sailing schedules. I did notice recently that the Steam Packet Company called its pricing fares changes from 1st of January a strategic reset. Can the Minister advise then whether the Sea Services Agreement was complied with and 6 months' notice was given to the company of the intention to do a strategic reset of the Sea Services Agreement, or was that just ignored? Was the Sea Services Agreement just ignored? And have the public been ignored in this whole process? Because quite clearly the Tynwald resolution of 2023 was for a general call for evidence, including the public, and there's been no public consultation about this.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware that the public have been ignored, because I am aware that the company has run a number of focus groups and has been reaching out and had run their survey over the summer as well. So I don't think the company are ignoring the public at all.
Supplementary, Mr Glover.
Good reminder, Lord. It seems obviously the Select Committee report is key in this. I think it's 3 months overdue in any case. You mentioned imminently. Is that before the new year or after the new year, to your knowledge?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's not necessarily my job because I'm not chair of the committee, I am a member. However, the report was finalised very, very recently and is going through the motions of being published, and so you can expect it to appear really soon, I hope. I know that the committee did revise the report in light of changes that were made across the summer, because every time they seem to land on something, it all shifted a little bit, and so that is what's contributed to the delay in the report. And I appreciate that it is needed, and we do need it out as soon as possible so that we can move on.
And to question 2, call on the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister without portfolio how he intends to approach the £10 million efficiency programme and if he will make a statement.
Call the Minister without portfolio to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In September at the Government Conference, the Chief Minister announced that he had tasked the Chief Executive Officer, Isle of Man Government, to draw up a government efficiency and reform programme to deliver at a minimum £10 million of savings and efficiencies outside of healthcare. Whilst the Council of Ministers are yet to fully agree the detailed approach to the £10 million efficiency programme, there has been a significant amount of activity completed across the various central functions overseen by the Chief Officer Group. Departments remaining within their existing budgets remain a crucial part of the efficiency programme. To this end, the Treasury are supporting departments with back-to-balance programmes, where required, to ensure that spending is managed appropriately and that the medium-term financial plan can be met. Mr Speaker, alongside this, the Council of Ministers and the Chief Officer Group are looking at both short-term and long-term savings within departments with a keen focus on digitisation and efficiencies. The Chief Minister will update Tynwald Court in January 2025 on efficiency-related matters, and if it is appropriate, the Chief Minister will also write to honourable members before the end of this month with an update on the efficiency programmes. Mr Speaker, as Minister without portfolio, my role consists of assisting and advising the Chief Minister with delivery and the efficiency programmes across government. Ultimately, the Chief Minister retains oversight of these programmes. As well as the efficiency programmes, I will have a focus on external relations, and I will also be supporting the Chief Minister and the Council of Ministers with departmental budgets. Thank you.
Mr Hooper, supplementary question.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for that answer. It seems that he talked a lot about what the CEO is doing, what the Treasury is doing, what departments are doing, even what the Chief Minister is doing. There wasn't really a lot about what he is doing in this role. It seems very much that my honourable friend has become a title holder in search of a task. Can he advise whether or not he has any budget or staff allocated to him to support his leadership of the efficiency programmes?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, and I thank the honourable member for his supplementary. As of this moment, until Council of Ministers have been briefed, there's very little I can say to the honourable members, and I would expect the honourable member to understand that, and that briefing is coming up very shortly. And as I've said, the Chief Minister will be briefing Tynwald in July, and if he feels there's anything that needs to be said before that, he will, as I said also, he would write to members. I actually have no staff, except for I'm using the Cabinet Office staff at the moment. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It doesn't sound like Santa's bringing us any efficiency savings, does it? So it was announced in September about efficiencies and effectiveness of government. Here we are in December. Can the Minister say, obviously he's only been in the role a week or so, what has actually been delivered? There's no point saying to anybody we'll get back to balance if nobody's getting back to balance. What is he actually doing to achieve back to balance by the 31st of March 2025?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Very quickly on that one, because when the honourable member says there's been no efficiencies, I've taken on no extra staff to help me. I'm using the staff that we have available. The honourable member may pull faces. I've been in the job just over a week. Please give me the opportunity to get my feet under the desk and work with the Chief Minister and those that are involved. And as I've said, the Chief Minister will update honourable members as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Question, Mr Thomas.
Thank you. We learned yesterday in written answer W2024011366 from the Treasury Minister that in fact Treasury started this back at the end of last year by engaging external consultancy support to perform a wider review of possible efficiencies and cost improvements across all departments during 2023 and early 2024. Recommendations arising from that are being considered now apparently inside a broader cabinet government efficiency and cost improvement programme. Will the Minister undertake to confirm that he's received all those Treasury recommendations from the 2023-24 that have already been made, and will he circulate those to members and put them in public?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I haven't received all of those, so I'm not aware of what all of those are that the honourable members talked about. There's obviously quite a few documents there. As I've said, Comin are due to be briefed very shortly. As the three members that have just asked me supplementary questions would be aware of being former ministers, they would be aware of the process that Comin has to be briefed first. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr Hooper, supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm quite content to give my honourable colleague some time to get his feet under the table, but what I'm lacking is some clarity on exactly what table he is getting his feet under. He's talked a lot here about the Chief Minister is going to provide an update, and yet the government press release when he was appointed stated that he would be taking a leadership role in the efficiency programme. That doesn't seem to be consistent with what we're now being told this morning in the House. So can my honourable friend, the Minister, with that purpose, please perhaps provide some information on when we're going to get some clarity on his role?
Minister to reply.
When the Chief Minister briefs Tynwald, either by Tynwald in July or by, in January, sorry, Mr Speaker, or by letter as soon as possible.
Supplementary, Ms Edge. No, sorry, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and to the Minister for these helpful answers. I'm glad that he believes he will get all the information from Treasury. Does the Minister have a view why it might be that Treasury would be transferring this role to Cabinet Office when, for instance, the last time that we tried to secure added value and efficiencies, the so-called SAVE programme was actually led by Treasury for a couple of years. Mr Hooper was even a member for a short while until he voted the wrong way in the budget. Would the Minister advise why he believes Cabinet Office is taking this forward rather than Treasury that has responsible for the public resources and public finances of the Isle of Man?
Minister to reply.
I can't advise my honourable colleague why that would be, but as I said in my statement, I will be working with all departments across government to help this work, and that would include Treasury and every other government department as well. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just wonder if the Minister can confirm that the instruction that's being given is to no impacts on frontline services throughout government, not just the health service.
Minister to reply.
Sorry, Mr Speaker, I just missed the first few words.
So that there'll be no impact on frontline services. I'm already aware that there's some budget cuts in frontline services, but can you confirm, is it only frontline services in the DHSC that's not going to be impacted by this, or is it other departments like education and elsewhere?
Minister.
I'm not in a place to confirm that or deny it, Mr Speaker. As I said, Comin have not been briefed yet on the way forward.
Now, turn to question 3. Call on the Honourable Member for Arbury Castlemaine, Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Chairman of the Post Office what impact assessment was carried out before changing the first and last weekly collection times for the main post office in Castletown. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Chairman of the Post Office to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Indicative volume information taken at the collection time from post boxes has historically been used to assess customer impact when Isle of Man Post Office has considered changing the times and or the removal of post boxes as letter volumes decline. This is done in conjunction with any operational changes or enhancements at the time of the review. Collections are made at 5 p.m. Monday to Friday from the post box outside the post office in Castletown Square.
Mr Morehouse, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Chairman accept that with 7 days in a week, when collections are not taking place over a 3-day period between Friday at 5 o'clock and Monday at 5 o'clock, many potential customers are actually going to be frustrated by this and stopping using the service and looking for alternatives? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Chairman to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What I can say to the honourable member is that no customer complaints regarding this post box have been received, so I don't think it's the problem that he's making it out to be. Also, the post office is supposed to be operating in an efficient manner, and very few people, if any, would want to use post boxes over the weekend. I think people are now used to the fact that they aren't opened and collected from over the weekend.
Morehouse, supplementary.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Chair. I think it's beyond the weekend, though. 5 o'clock on a Monday afternoon is pretty late. Does that actually impact on the time when those letters that are going to the UK and beyond actually arrive in the UK? Because sure, if they aren't collected until after 5 o'clock in the evening, that's going to have a subsequent impact on when they will arrive elsewhere. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Chairman to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What we've got to remember here is that local letters continue to decline, and we're talking about 56% over the last 10 years alone. So the business has got to be structured in such a way to sweat the assets and make the most of what we've got, without sometimes having a wish list of things that it might be nice to do. In terms of whether or not a 5 o'clock collection is going to get to the UK the next day, probably I would suggest, and I'm not operational, I would suggest not. But for anything that is urgent, there is a service from postal headquarters and from other places around the island where people can choose a premium service that is guaranteed to get there the next day.
Allinson, supplement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Chair of the Post Office agree with me that after just answering a question, the Minister without portfolio answering a question about efficiency programmes, that the Isle of Man Post Office is similarly trying to deliver a much more efficient and productive service for the people of the Isle of Man, and the postage rates that are currently charged on the Isle of Man are significantly less than on the adjacent isle? Thank you.
Reply.
I thank the Minister for his question, and yes, he's quite right. The cost of first-class post in the Isle of Man that will go to the UK is 85 pence. In the UK, a letter that will come to the Isle of Man will cost £1.65. So there's a significant benefit for Isle of Man customers in that.
Not going to go down a rabbit hole of discussing efficiencies about collection times in Castletown. Mr Morehouse, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have one overriding concern, that is every time I ask a question linking to this, it always goes back to the number of people who've actually complained. In terms of complaints, nowadays people just look for alternatives or stop using it. Is that something the Post Office has actually considered, that when these services are actually reduced, people just think, well, we'll try something else, we'll try another way, rather than actually go forward and look at ways in which the service could be used more frequently? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Post Office is very cognizant of the fact that it's in a competitive industry, an increasingly competitive industry. And if anybody within the Post Office management team think that they're missing an opportunity to offer a service that is going to make money, then it will look very carefully at that. However, I think what the Honourable Questioner is asking are questions about a declining service where there really isn't the flexibility or the need or the desire to particularly bolster those services. But I take his point, and competition is very important. And if we thought that we could offer a service that is missing, I'm sure we'd do it.
Turn to question 4. I call on the Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Chief Minister what authority the Minister for Infrastructure has to act on matters relating to hydrocarbon licensing in general and regarding the Kroger licence with the Department of Infrastructure.
Minister to reply.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Infrastructure has authority to act on matters relating to hydrocarbon licensing as the Petroleum Act 1986 vests the property in petroleum and natural gas within the island to the Department of Infrastructure. The Department of Infrastructure was able to grant the Seawood Production Innovate licence to Kroger Limited as per the provisions of the Petroleum Act 1986, which sets out that the department may grant to such persons as it thinks fit licences to search and bore for and get petroleum. The Seawood Production Innovate licence between the Department of Infrastructure and Kroger Limited is a commercial contract, and in their roles as the department, the Minister has the authority to act on matters relating to this licence.
Thomas, supplementary.
Thank you very much. That's good to have that confirmed, given the well-informed and well-briefed answer provided last week. But Energy Policy Board's terms of reference state explicitly that the Energy Policy Board has sufficient authority, that no minister is authorised to act on matters relating to energy policy areas, including hydrocarbon licensing, without first consulting with the board and receiving the authority to proceed. So does the minister have the authority to vary the licence according to the evidence?
Chief Minister to reply.
So the Energy Policy Board is not a decision-making board, Mr. Speaker, under the terms of reference of that board. If there are specific decisions sought, then they are to be taken to the Council of Ministers, but the Energy Policy Board does act as a coordinating body.
Mr Thomas, supplementary.
I think the two answers to date have been contradictory then, but I'll state what I understand them to be for Hansard. So the Energy Policy Board, and beyond that, the Council of Ministers coordinates decisions, but the the authority lies with the Minister of Infrastructure in respect of the Kroger licence. These same Energy Policy Board terms of reference identify an energy team of specialist officers within Cabinet Office who will, quote, manage and oversee all aspects related to energy policy, including hydrocarbons, and more specifically, where expert external resources are required, these will be commissioned and controlled by the energy team. Does the Minister have her own, that's the Minister of Infrastructure, have her own human and financial resources in the department for the Kroger licensing decision, or are the officers and budgets involved in Cabinet Office and under the control of the Energy Policy Board, the Energy Team and the Council of Ministers apparently?
So, I know the Honourable Member is the master of smoke and mirrors, so let me be absolutely crystal clear back to him and indeed to this Honourable Court, Mr Speaker, via yourself of course, that the Energy Policy Board's terms of reference specifically say that the Board has sufficient authority that no Minister is authorised to act on matters relating to energy policy (power) areas without first consulting the Board and receiving its authority to proceed. Power areas connected with the island, Mr Speaker. Day-to-day operational matters relating to energy policy do not fall within the Board's remit. So let's be crystal clear, this matter, as I have stated, is a matter for the Department of Infrastructure as the decision maker. Should Energy Policy Board consider full direction is needed, then that matter must be referred to the Council of Ministers. As any other department that was seeking direction, higher authority direction from Council on a collective matter would be required or asked to do so.
Mr Thomas?
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. So, to be clear then, an energy policy, the energy power policy areas include hydrocarbon licence, but the decision to vary the Kroger licence is now an operational decision for the Minister of Infrastructure, and it probably always has been. Can the Chief Minister confirm it probably always has been an operational decision of the Minister of Infrastructure? And just for clarity, given that the terms of reference of the Energy Policy Board are becoming clearer today than they ever have before, can the Chief Minister confirm that the Energy Policy Board still comprises the Chief Minister, the Minister for Treasury, the Minister for Department of Infrastructure, the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture and the Chair of Manx Utilities, or have any of those ministerial and chair memberships changed, or are any of those people represented by departmental members, as is possible inside those terms of reference?
Chief Minister.
No, the Board, as outlined in the terms of reference, stand, as does the requirements of that Board.
Turn to question 5. Call on the Honourable Member for Castlemaine, Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Treasury Minister what the cost was of demolishing the former Ballyclone Primary School, how much the site was sold for, and whether it was sold on the open market. Thank you.
On the Treasury Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for their question. Demolition of the former Ballyclone Primary School on Demesne Road in Douglas was procured and managed by the Department of Infrastructure. The demolition in January 2023 was funded through their minor capital works budget at a total cost of £68,000. Treasury are currently unable to provide the value of the Ballyclone's school site as the sale has not yet been completed. The potential sale is being conducted in line with the financial regulations FPN F.03, which referred to the disposal of land and buildings and has not been advertised on the open market. Thank you.
Mr Morehouse, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Why does the government still demolish empty buildings? Doesn't this case perfectly illustrate the issue that if a building is demolished, it's actually costing a department something, a substantial sum, and the developer or the next user would naturally deal with that issue? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for his question. The Ballyclone site and that of Fairfield Junior School nearby closed in 2016, so this building has been vacant for a considerable period of time. Their use was found for it, particularly during the pandemic, but it's certainly surplus to requirements, and so demolition was seen as the best way forward. And in fact, the areas around this area were included in the Unoccupied Urban Sites Register in 2020, and so were very much zoned as areas of economic development. I think the Honourable Member is absolutely right. When buildings are surplus to requirement and are just left empty for long periods of time, there is ongoing cost to government, particularly the Department for Infrastructure, in terms of heating, lighting and insurance. And what we need to do, and what the Brownfield Site Regeneration Group is trying to do, is to bring these sites back into economic use. And often demolition is the first point to try to achieve that. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Domain Road is the way you pronounce it, not Desamy. So the minor capital fund for the Department of Infrastructure was mentioned for £68,000. Can the Minister confirm how much went out of the minor capital fund for the Department of Education?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I thank the Honourable Member for her correction of my pronunciation. I do apologise. I know the road well, but my pronunciation of certain roads in the Douglas area, and no doubt the Onchan area, is deficient, since I try to spend most of my time up in the north. Thank you. In terms of the demolition costs, these were released by the DOI in terms of an FOI request on the 25th of May 2023. And came from the Department for Infrastructure budget in terms of the demolition of the building. And obviously then the potential disposal of that site was then put through to other government departments as the financial regulations and the Council Minister's policy dictates. Thank you.
Mr Thomas, supplementary.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just clarify three things. The first one is that my recollection is that FOI, and certainly the practice suggests that this was a use of funds from the Education Department minor capital works budget authorised by officers. Can the Treasury Minister please confirm that today, or undertake to confirm that, because obviously that money could have been spent on Castle Russian High School repairs or on or on other school repairs and so on. Secondly, can the Treasury Minister clarify what he meant by surrounded by an area classified as unoccupied urban sites? I mean, this isn't a comprehensive treatment area, and this was a school that had been repurposed for a number of years. So seems to be some creative use of language. And thirdly, can the Minister confirm that he indicated then that departments were offered this site under the Council Minister's policy? Is it actually departments, or is it Manx Development Corporation that was offered it? And if so, is Manx Development Corporation classified as a department for the purposes of the policy to which he refers?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I mean, so I wrote those 3 points down. In terms of the demolition, as I said, this was procured and managed by the Department of Infrastructure, and the demolition was funded through their minor capital works budget. I will go and check that those details with officers, and obviously if I've made a mistake, I will correct that. In terms of the use of the school, as I've said in my original answer, the supplementary answers, there was some use made of the school building subsequent to when it stopped being used for educational reasons, but actually that the use then would basically stopped, and so it was derelict for some time. And in terms of the approach, section 8 of the policy really talks about to approach all government bodies to be given first refusal to purchase the land of the buildings. Rather than government departments, but obviously that also deals with the disposal in the best national interest. Thank you.
Mr Morehouse, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Are the Manx Development Corporation currently making use of the site, and if they are, what legal agreement is in place? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Manx Development Corporation was given permission to use the site as a temporary parking for storage of plant vehicles and equipment for its nearby development project to the old nurses' home on Westmorelands Road. Thank you.
Ms Edge, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And just to follow on from that, so Manx Development Corporation are using a government site. Are they being charged a rental agreement under the licence, or there's got to be something in place to ensure that that land that still belongs to Isle of Man government, not the Manx Development Corporation, being so returning like every other site on the island where rents are going up, etc. And obviously they've appear to have taken control and causing difficulties for businesses in the area as well, Manx Development Corporation.
Treasury Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I thank the Honourable Member for her supplementary question. I mean, I would say that in terms of causing differences or problems to surrounding businesses, I think the development of the former nurses' home, there's been an awful lot of public engagement and engagement with those surrounding businesses to make sure that any disruption is kept to the minimum. This is a large-scale project and obviously has taken up a lot of time and effort to get it right. And I'm very grateful to those honourable members who took up the invitation of a tour of the building on Friday to look at how it has developed into a very good reinvigoration of an old derelict building that now can be brought back into economic life. And hopefully that will be on time and on budget to open and start taking people in for rental in the first quarter of the new year. Thank you.
On to question, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much. So I'm not sure I heard the answer to how much the DOI is earning now on its vacant site from the Manx Development Corporation, so perhaps the Minister can circulate that. And along similar lines, the Department of Infrastructure has a minor capital works budget for 10, 15 people around government. That's how shared services works. So who instructed the use of Education Department's minor capital works? Can the Minister confirm it wasn't a political decision, it was officer to officer? And can the Minister confirm that this effectively is extra money that's being provided to Manx Development Corporation from other people's budgets?
Somewhat strained from the demolition of Balaclone School. Minister?
Well, we are, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. Again, he's presupposing something that I said I'd go and look at in terms of whether the minor capital works budget was coming from the Education Department or the DOI, and I'm quite happy to do that. Thank you.
Mr. Morehouse, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's almost 3 years since demolition, and the Manx Development Corporation have been showing interest in the site for quite a while. Could the Minister tell us how close to agreeing a sale price we are and when he expects the final agreement to take place? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The vacant site has been valued by the government valuer back in June this year, and as I said, there are ongoing works to look at the disposal of this site for that value. Thank you.
Turn to question 6, calling the honourable member for Hampton, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for the Treasury, further to written answers W202301-620 and W202401-1347, if he will publish the further analysis and further review undertaken as referenced in the National Insurance Reform Proposals document dated the 18th of July 2022.
On the Treasury Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the honourable member for Ramsey for their question. Section 5 of the National Insurance Reform Proposals document dated the 18th of July 2022 relates to the payment of national insurance over state pension age and states further analysis was carried out. The outcome of the further analysis is summarised in the document as follows. It is clear that a relatively small number of individuals, approximately 700, who have reached state pension age and are employed, will be liable to pay national insurance contributions if the exemptions were removed. A significant number of these people are in vital roles such as education and health, and therefore it is imperative that any decision does not have an adverse economic impact. The Assessor of Income Tax has advised me that it is not appropriate for the details of the analysis to be published due to the small number of employees in some sectors. This is because it may be possible to identify a person and the amounts they may be liable to pay. I am happy, however, to offer some further details to this Honourable House. When the analysis was carried out in 2022, it was based on national insurance data for the 2020 to 21 year. There was at least one person of state pension age or older employed within 36 sectors. The medical and health service sector accounted for 22% of employed persons of state pension age or over, followed by public administration with 19% and education and retail, each comprising 7%. The other 32 sectors, which had lower numbers of employees of state pension age or over, accounted for the remaining 45%. The grand total of Class 1 national insurance contributions, which would have been paid by persons of state pension age, cannot be accurately calculated as the relevant earnings information is not held on the individual's national insurance record. Based on the national insurance contributions paid by employers in the 2020 to 21 tax year in respect of employees who were state pension age or over, it is estimated that an additional 1.3 million would have been paid had the exemption not been in place and the Class 1 rate of 11% charged, as well as the additional rate of 1% were applicable. In the interest of full transparency, it is not possible to estimate the additional national insurance revenue which may be generated by people who are self-employed and of state pension age or over. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for that further information, and I think I'd like to thank him as well for finally admitting that there actually is further analysis work that's been undertaken. I've asked 3 questions now to try and get this simple fact stated. So it's good that the Minister has finally decided to be open and transparent about this. I'm concerned, however, that he is standing here saying he is not going to publish that further analysis work that's been undertaken. That is something of real concern to me, because this policy that the Treasury is pursuing seems to have been consulted on once. The information actually indicated that more people were in support of making a change than were opposed to it. There is analysis been undertaken by PwC, which again has been published by the Treasury as part of the consultation response. There are probably meaningful changes that could be made to improve the fairness of the system, and yet the Treasury are sitting here telling us that we are not able to see that underlying analysis, and we have to take the Treasury Minister at his word that the summary that's been provided is an accurate representation of the facts. So can I ask the Minister again if he will publish that detailed further analysis that has been undertaken, that he has confirmed now exists?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I've said, I thank the Honourable Member for his further supplementary question, and he's quite right. There was a public consultation back in 2016 which looked at this issue. That was on the basis of the CI65 report, and since then we've also had the PwC report as well looking into this, and further consultation looking at owner-managed businesses. But as I said in my original answer, the Assessor of Income Tax had advised me it is not appropriate for the details of the analysis to be published due to the small number of employees in some sectors.
Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So the Minister is standing here telling us then that the level of information that has been analysed is purely the financial data, purely the information around how much money people are paying. That is quite an interesting thing to admit, because actually the policy implications of this are far wider than simply how much money people are paying into the system. There are questions around fairness, around intergenerational fairness, around equity, around equality, at which the Minister's published equality assessment, strangely enough, does no assessment of whatsoever. So the Treasury Minister is confirming then that the only further analysis that was undertaken before the Treasury made this decision was based on the financial information, i.e. how much money they could squeeze out of people. This wasn't actually about the fairness of the system, the appropriateness of the system, or how to make sure the people over state retirement age could actually continue to benefit from things like being able to enhance their state pension or still be able to be eligible for contributory benefits. The analysis they've undertaken that they are refusing to publish is purely based on how much money the Treasury could raise.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Honourable Member for his question. I understand his frustration, because this is quite a complicated issue. It's not simply in terms of contributions, it's also about the fairness for those retired people who continue to work because they want to work or because they have to work. And I think the equality assessment of this that was carried out by Treasury makes it quite clear that this has been something that's been in place since July 1948 on the key principle that national insurance contributions are paid by employees, very much so that they can gain access to various benefits going forward. And we know that people past the retirement age are ineligible for a range of benefits, including job seekers allowance and incapacity benefit. So that's where some of the equality issues come into this. The Honourable Member also makes the very interesting comment about people being able to top up their pensions because they're working past a pension age when they'd be claiming a pension. And I think he is absolutely right to point out that some people on our islands will not have the maximum number of qualifying years, and so will be ineligible to top it up under the current situation. To change that so that people can carry on working, claim a pension, but then that will be increased year on year by the contributions, would be a significant change to our national insurance system and put us very much at odds with the adjacent isle, but it's certainly something I'm sure will come up with the motion in the other place next week. Thank you.
Question, Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister would commit to circulating the economic impact assessment that's been carried out.
Reply.
Well, I thank the honourable member for her question. I've circulated again the written answers that have all the various assessments that have been carried out, mainly the equality assessment. In terms of an economic impact assessment, we are going back to the honourable member for Ramsey's criticism that it's all about the money. And this is far more than just about the money that could be raised or could be paid by people of a pensionable age. It's more about the fairness of the system on both sides. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So the Treasury Minister has now accepted that actually this is far more about the money that was raised, but he still hasn't answered the question whether Treasury has actually undertaken any analysis of that. Has there been any work done at all on issues such as people being able to continue to qualify for pension if they were to pay in beyond state pension age? The answer to that is no. There is nothing in any of the information that has been published or provided so far that indicates this was even considered by the Treasury as part of their work. So can the Treasury Minister actually confirm that this further analysis that exists has considered all of these wide-ranging implications for the policy proposal that he is absolutely right will be coming to Tynwald for discussion next week? Or is he going to confirm that actually none of this stuff has come across Treasury's table and the only analysis work they've undertaken is around the money that can be raised by the Treasury? It's a really important question that I think he should answer.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his really important question. In terms of the analysis that was provided, it was initially very much based on the quantum of the amount of money that would be paid if people continued to contribute towards national insurance past their retirement age, and looking at the breakdown in terms of the various sectors that were involved, which, as I've explained, is quite wide-ranging, including education and health and social care. But alongside that, I think that's made quite clearly in the equality impact assessment, was looking at the ability for people post-retirement age to benefit from some of the benefits that they were paying towards, and the fact that our legislation at the moment precludes that. And so going forward, if it was to be that people past retirement age were paying national insurance contributions, there would have to be revaluation of the benefit system to make sure that they were treated properly and fairly. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much. Can the it would be a shame if standards had fallen since 2014, 15, 16, when we last looked at national insurance with substantial officer and external consultancy report. Can the Treasury Minister undertake to recirculate and republish any missing documents from the 2014 to 2016 analysis of national insurance, which included this very item, because that in itself might be helpful? So anything from the National Insurance Review then?
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And actually, Google has done that for me. And so the consultation response document in terms of the proposed changes to national insurance for workers over a state pension age, which is issued by the Treasury Tax Division of, the Income Tax Division of the Treasury, published on the 16th of February 2016, is available online and makes for quite interesting reading. And obviously, the Honourable Member for Ramsey has referred to that. Thank you.
On to question 7, call on the Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to ask the Minister for the Treasury how much of any contingency budgets were used for the Isle of Man ferry terminal in Liverpool in the financial year 23-24, whether there are sufficient funds in those budgets for 24-25, and which regulations, practice notes and policies cover the financing of capital expenditure greater than that approved by Tynwald.
On the Treasury Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for his very interesting question. Obviously, with his background in the Department of Infrastructure, he'll know some of the complexities of this project, which I'm glad to see it has now been completed and is now operational. But obviously, the financial matters are ongoing. Due to ongoing legal adjudication, Treasury are unable to disclose the details of the contingency payments that may have been made in respect of the Isle of Man ferry terminal in Liverpool. As previously communicated, the time to debate this project is when we have the final account and all the facts are clear, at which point the cost of the Isle of Man ferry terminal will be certain and the Department for Infrastructure will be able to request a supplementary vote. In terms of regulations, practice notes and policies, the capital contingency budget sits as a Treasury scheme within the full capital programme. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thomas.
Thank you very much. So, So in the last pink book that we saw, unusually, there was the figure of 70.676 million with an asterisk next to it saying final cost subject to confirmation and separate Tynwald vote. That wasn't the budget for a particular year. It was the total estimated cost, the total Tynwald approval to 31st of March 2024 and the total spend to 31st of March 2024. Has the Treasury Minister just confirmed that the final cost will be any percentage above that amount, because there is no Tynwald or Treasury or government policy that applies in terms of exceeding the Tynwald approved budget.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member will know there is very clear policy in terms of exceeding a Tynwald approved budget. What I've outlined in my answer is that that final amount is yet to be determined. There is ongoing legal adjudication on a range of different payments that have already been made by the DOI towards the various contractors involved with this quite complex scheme, and also some payments that are now being requested which are being disputed. And as soon as we have that final sum, which will obviously be unfortunately above the 70 million pounds he talks about, then that will be brought back to Tynwald in terms of a supplementary vote by the Department for Infrastructure. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Mr. Glover.
When does the Minister expect that we will know when the final sum is going to be known?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. And I would genuinely like to know now so it can be budgeted for. One of the intricacies of the contract is that adjudication and any legal disputes over some of the disputed sums involved can continue for up to 12 months from the completion of the project. So we're certainly looking into the first and second quarter of next year. But we are engaging specialist legal advice to try to absolutely ensure that where the Department for Infrastructure feels that an overrun or an overspend was not as a result of any change in designs or unexpected consequences of the complexity of the scheme, that is challenged absolutely. And we try to deliver a accurate price for the completed scheme going forward. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas, supplementary.
Thank you very much. So to give a few numbers to help the public understand, obviously when the December 2021 approval was given, £5 million around that time was also put into the contingency fund, and I think Tynwald members were briefed in the Brule Suite that £5 million was a contingency for the Isle of Man Liverpool ferry terminal in Liverpool, and certainly some of the media picked up that there was that contingency. Then the Treasury Minister confused people possibly by talking about £10 million in July 2023 as a contingency fund for the Isle of Man Liverpool ferry terminal. And with today's answer, I think the Treasury Minister's just said that there's 23.225 million in Treasury's contingency budgets at the moment for capital projects inflation and capital projects contingency. So are any of those numbers relevant to working out how much the final cost of the Isle of Man ferry terminal in Liverpool could be? Secondly, it does say very clearly in the Pink Book, even in the most recent iteration in February 2024, that the funding of scheme overspends up to 500,000 is delegated to Treasury from Tynwald, not above 500,000. So the Treasury Minister said it's clear what the policy is. Can the Treasury Minister just make it even clearer by explaining exactly how Tynwald is involved? Or has Treasury got complete power in this?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I thank the honourable member for his questions. As he is aware, there is a capital contingency and also a capital inflationary contingency budget held within Treasury to deal with some of these large infrastructure projects and deal with some of the overspends that we've seen. In terms of Treasury's role in this, no, Treasury doesn't have absolute power. Tynwald has absolute power. but Treasury are trying to work with the Department for Infrastructure at the moment to come up with a final cost for this project that can then come to Tynwald in a supplementary vote. As yet, as I've explained, we do not have that final cost. Thank you.
Question, Mr. Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister able to give us an indication of the proportions of the additional sums which relate to, one, the overspend, and two, disputed sums? And are both categories of spend being dealt with in a similar manner? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for his question. The way the contract was set up was that often bills will be presented by the various contractors that are then paid by Department for Infrastructure, and then later there's an adjudication process to see whether they are still valid. In terms of overspends and what is seen by the contractor to be additional costs that were not catered for in the additional contract, they are all wrapped up together, together with some of the technical difficulties that have arisen in terms of the construction of this site. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much. And to avoid misunderstanding, can the Treasury Minister just confirm that it's not sort of a random contract generated by AGs or somebody like that? This is a classic NECC Type 4 Option C contract that's used everywhere, firstly. And secondly, can he also confirm that the political and officer management of this contract is outsourced to private sector, but it's overseen by a cross-government body since 2020, with Treasury representation, DFE representation, Steam Packet representation, and in the background DOI as client representation. The next question is that there is a written answer, I think, which addresses Mr. Morehouse's question. So the certainty where it can be provided has already been provided in a written answer, and it's a tiny number of million. The rest is disputed, it seems. And secondly, can the Treasury Minister confirm that the 12 months after the contract ends has also been published, which is April 2025. So that's after the budget. So how will the Treasury Minister be dealing with that in terms of the budget this year? With hindsight, does the Treasury Minister not agree it would have been better to take the first approach that Council Ministers adopted, which is to make a statement on the order paper in July 2023 about all of these complexities, rather than bringing a £10 million contingency bid that Mr. Speaker had to unravel on the floor of Tynwald?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for the question. He's detailed the contract type of this. I would disagree with him in terms of DOI being in the background of this. He's quite right, they are the client. And he is also right that this quite complicated infrastructure project on the adjacent Isle was carried out by external contractors and has been overseen in the recent past by a pan-governmental group, getting specialist advice in as well to make sure that the facility can be delivered, can be operational, and then some of these outstanding financial details are dealt with. As I said, I share his frustration in terms of getting an accurate end figure for this project, but with the legal adjudications taking place as we speak, hopefully that can be determined. In terms of the budgetary aspects to this, obviously Treasury are waiting to hear from the Department for Infrastructure about the ongoing liabilities. Those will be presented to the public as soon as possible, and the Department of Infrastructure will be coming forward for a supplementary vote when the final quantum is determined. Thank you.
Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a recent answer provided to me with regards to contingency funds, it was very clear on there that it excludes contingency payments in respect of the Liverpool Ferry Terminal. So clearly there's a fund there at the present time. However, it does have a new Tynwald approval, and it also states there's a discrete scheme called Capital Projects Contingency Fund. Can the Treasury Minister advise if the Department of Infrastructure come in higher than the figures that are still left in the account, where is he going to find the money from?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I've said, any eventual figure that's needed to deal with the cost of this project will come to Tynwald as a supplementary bid.
Further supplementary, Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And also the Minister talked about the complexities and the legal people that are involved. Can the Minister confirm which accounting officer was responsible for this project and whether there will be any areas addressed where there's been any faults or errors with regards to payment of invoices within the sector, and who the accounting officer would, under the financial regulations that the Minister has talked about, who would be held to account and perhaps provided with further training or something with regards to how they can improve the way they practice around capital schemes.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Honourable Member for our supplementary question. The Department for Infrastructure are the key department leading this project, but I agree with her that there are some significant issues, and I'd like to thank the Public Accounts Committee for their instrumental report, which detailed some of the complexities of the way that this project was set up, and also detailed things that could be done to make sure that further large capital projects could be handled in a more efficient and effective way. Thank you.
Turn to question 8, call on the Honourable Member for Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd just like to ask the Minister for Treasury whether a person whose sole income was the basic state pension would have to pay income tax.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for her question. The basic state pension is a component of the pre-April 2019 retirement pension. The weekly pension rate is £169.50 a week, which equates to £8,814 annually. The current income tax personal allowance is £14,500, so if this was the sole income a person has, this would be covered by the personal allowance, and so no tax would be due. In relation to the Manx state pension, which is awarded to persons from April 2019, the full amount is £241.50 a week, £12,558 annually. So if this was the sole income a person has, it too would be covered by the personal allowance, and so no tax would be due. However, it would be unusual for persons to only be in receipt of these amounts. If a pre-April 2019 pensioner had also qualified for the full Manx pension supplement, this could add a further £53.75 a week to their pension, and most pensioners will also have earned an amount of additional pensions known as SERPs. The additional pension is earnings related and varies from person to person, but can be up to £218.39 per week. It is therefore entirely possible, should a pensioner be in receipt of all three components, that they would pay income tax. Turning to the post-April 2019 pensioners, they too can qualify for the Manx pension supplement. The amount that is awarded is reduced over time, will be phased out entirely from the 5th of January 2039, but is currently £38.30 a week. So a new pensioner being awarded a full Manx state pension today with the Manx pension supplement would receive £14,549.60 annually. In addition, some post-April 2019 pensioners receive a further addition to their total amount based on their previous additional pension entitlement, and therefore it would be possible for a pensioner in receipt of the Manx state pension plus the Manx pension supplement to pay income tax. Mr Speaker, although the Honourable Member is not asked, I would like to clarify that should a pensioner be in receipt of income support, this payment is not taxable and therefore would not be taken into account when determining their income tax liability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank the Minister for that response. So the area that I'm very interested in is the one that he's just stated with regards to post-2019, £14,549, which is clearly above the personal allowance threshold for income tax. So does the Minister feel it's right and appropriate that our pensioners receive a bill from his department to be paid for in January when they're on that very basic pension because the personal allowance is not at that figure? So many pensioners, particularly in my constituency area, have received bills from our income tax department asking for them to pay upfront a bill by January. However, they will probably end up then having to get a tax rebate. Is that cost effective, Mr. President Speaker? Which one are you?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her comments. Part of this issue, obviously, is due to the fact that in the budget in February, the basic state pension was increased by 8% and the max state pension was increased by 8.5%, whereas the personal allowance was not increased in the 2024 budget. I made a commitment at that time to look at the personal allowance and will be working with honourable members for the budget for 2025 to look again at this and make sure that as many people as possible are taken out of the income tax threshold. Thank you.
Honourable members, that concludes the hour available for questions.
Speaker, I beg to move that we finish the question paper.
Second.
Put the question that we complete the question paper. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. In which case, we turn to the next supplementary question. Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder, whilst the Minister has taken that piece of work to look at this and to try and ensure the personal allowances are uplifted to cover this, whether he would take to looking at the process of the automatic bills that go out to our pensioners if they know they're on a threshold that's below the living wage, because certainly 14,549 is not a living wage on the Isle of Man. So to actually send a bill out to our pensioners is quite stressful, and then they suddenly have to try and find money to pay that bill in January.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the point that she's made. The Income Tax Division do look at individual cases whereby they're not liable for income tax, trying to take them out of the whole system completely. But as I said, because of the changes in the February budget this year, there has been a significant increase in the value of state pensions, quite rightly so, given the inflation that people have experienced over the last 18 months. And so there will be a rebalancing of that as we go forward into next year. Thank you.
To question 9, call on the honourable member for Arbroath-Castlemaine, Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Enterprise what the process is for appealing the determination of the applicable rate of duty to be applied to the land transaction. Thank you.
On the Minister for Enterprise to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. As explained in a number of previous answers on this subject, the level of fees and duties applied to land transactions are set out in the Land, Deeds and Probate Registry's Fees and Duties Order 2023, an order which was approved by Tynwald. Fees are payable on receipt of the application by the Land or Deed Registries, regardless of the date of the transaction, and there's no discretion or vires to apply lesser fees dependent on circumstances such as late submission of an application. The only appeal process that could apply would be if an applicant wanted to argue that the decision as to the level of fee had been incorrectly determined by the Land Registry. This would be an appeal of a Land Registry decision pursuant to Section 6 of the Land Registration Act 1982, with such an appeal being made to the Land Commissioner. Thank you.
Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Duties and taxes are the remit of Treasury and require Treasury determination. Has the Central Registries any autonomy in this area, or are they simply carrying out the instructions of Treasury? Thank you.
And appeal processes, but Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, as I say, the fees are set out within the order, and they're set out and agreed by Tynwald. So it's a basic case of applying the relevant fee depending on the property. Thank you.
Question 10, call on the honourable member for Oncombe, Ms Edge.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister for Enterprise when the last review of local company directorships and Manx director status was.
Again, call on the Minister for Enterprise to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question. As part of the work that's ongoing in respect of assessing the island's risk to money laundering and the financing of terrorism proliferation, the Central Registries is presently undertaking a risk assessment of the transparency of legal structures that are formed on Ireland. The last substantive review of the island's companies legislation, which included reviewing their management, was undertaken between the period 2013 to 2015. And since then, a significant amount of changes, additional responsibilities and reporting requirements have been introduced at various points, such as the requirements around nominated officers, beneficial owners, and timely reporting of changes. To ensure the island remains compliant with its international obligations, the assessment is being carried out using the World Bank's risk assessment tool and will include a comprehensive analysis of who may act as a director, their roles and responsibilities, and the information that the company and the registry must hold on them. The registry anticipates this work being completed by May of next year. Thank you.
Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for advising of what the current work is. I wonder if the Minister would publish that previous work that was carried out and the review document that he mentioned in his answer.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yes, as I say, whatever, it's been I think it's not a specific document, it's been a rolling areas of improvement, but happy to gather whatever information I can for the Honourable Member. Thank you.
Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And clearly, obviously, the governance structure around this is a real important issue, and obviously using the World Bank risk assessment. Could the Minister confirm who is going to be responsible for any errors in any due diligence that were carried out on any previous registrations for company directors?
Minister to reply.
Well, my understanding would be that obviously it would be the responsibility of those putting themselves forward as directors to make sure that the information they're putting forward is correct to the registry. And if that wasn't to be the case, and there were areas that where it was deliberate action to say that some information was incorrect, then clearly that would be a situation where the registries would look to take action.
Mr Collister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just listening to the Minister's responses there, can you confirm if the registry still has a lot of the documentation submitted on an honesty basis from the individual submitting the information, or does the regulator actually go and actually check the information that's been submitted, especially in particular of new directors, etc.? I'd welcome his input.
Minister to reply.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As I said, there's been sort of ongoing improvements, as I say, since 2013, 2015 in that area, including, as I say, requirements around nominated officers, and obviously with the development of the beneficial ownership legislation, and timely reporting of changes which are necessary as part of that process. So it is an ongoing process. Clearly, depending on the type of company, whether it's a 1931 or a 2006 company, there are certain, again, different areas of responsibilities for the directors. And clearly there's also other areas of regulation and, for example, the FSA involved in that process. So I think there are layers of assessment, and of course businesses also have to put out their annual return, and it's right, proper, they have to have all the accurate information in place. So there are processes in place, but like I say, it's important that we're constantly looking at these and making sure that we're moving forward, and that's why it's important this further work is taking place. Thank you.
Mr Bunch, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Could the Minister confirm, because an awful lot of companies are set up through the corporate service providers, can he confirm, does the registry accept the corporate service providers' due diligence, or do they do their own on top of that?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can't answer that specifically. I'll have to get that information for the Honourable Member. As I say, at each level, clearly the regulatory framework's in place, so the FSA, self-regulation and the registry, but I will check that information and come back to you. Thank you.
Turn to question 11, call on the Honourable Member for Arbroath Castle Hamley, Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture what consideration has been given to amending the Tree Preservation Act 1993 to allow the removal of trees where the structure of an existing house is located within the tree's root protection area. Thank you.
On the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Tree Preservation Act 1993 aims to protect trees on our island. The Department believes that the current Tree Preservation Act provides effective measures to deal with a number of situations, including where trees may be causing damages to structures. The legislation seeks to strike a balance between protecting our valuable tree stock and addressing legitimate concerns relating to tree safety from property owners and tenants. Under the existing framework, if a property owner or someone acting with their consent believes a tree is causing damage to the property, there is a clear process to follow which requires them to provide evidence to support that claim. This could include reports from professionals such as surveyors or arborists demonstrating that the tree in question is causing or has the potential to cause damage. Once this evidence is gathered, the person can submit it as part of their application for a licence to carry out the necessary tree works. The department takes each application very seriously and reviews them thoroughly to ensure decisions are well informed. If the evidence submitted with the application supports the claim, the department will approve the licence, allowing the person to proceed with the appropriate measures. This could involve pruning branches or roots, or in some cases, removing the tree altogether. These actions are permitted only to prevent or mitigate property damage, maintaining a careful balance between safeguarding property and preserving our environment.
Question, Mr. Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. The Minister clearly identifies the requirement on the homeowner to actually prove that there is an issue in terms of the surveys and the additional information. But some homeowners find it very difficult and very challenging to actually get the required information. Is there any light touch systems available, or is this something the department has considered to allow these people to actually have their issues considered and possibly resolved? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although I referred to some of the things you may use, such as specialist reports from arborists, for example, people are able to submit their own evidence, but obviously that would need to be then verified by people who are qualified in that area, by our arborists, who will then review that information and make a decision. I think with everything that we talk about in this place and in the other place about the need to protect our tree stock, especially with some of the tree diseases that we know we are subject to across this island, I would be very reluctant to move to a light touch approach for those trees that do have significant amenity value and are in good condition.
Mr. Morehouse.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister able to give us an indication of how many trees have been removed in the last 3 years, simply because they're too close to an existing property, rather than the things you outlined there in terms of disease and things? And is a published list of all licences that have been granted still available? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been licences granted due to trees providing a low amenity value and/or the applicant providing evidence that the tree was causing structural damage to the property or other valid reasons. I'm not able to give a specific number related to those applications, as that would mean searching through over 2,200 applications individually.
Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wonder if the Minister could confirm with regards to infrastructure other than a home. So obviously there's lots of sewerage, etc. in our highways or hedgerows or back lanes. Who's responsible for that? And where a tree ends up in, say, part ownership of a property owner and then possibly a government department or local authority, has she had many cases of that, and what could she do to support and make change there?
Minister to reply.
Thank you. So the Tree Preservation Act determines applications based on the reasons for removal versus the amenity value. And in the case of other damaged infrastructure, that can equally be given consideration around whether there are remedial works that could be taken in order to repair said infrastructure and retain the tree, or whether in fact it would be necessary to remove the tree. But that would go through a similar process of assessment as with a property. So I acknowledge it's not just properties, it is for other structures as well. In terms of shared boundary trees, I suppose, obviously if tree roots extend across a boundary and you have tree roots in your area, you're able to do appropriate pruning to them as long as you're working within the Tree Preservation Act, even if that isn't a tree on your land, just as you would be able to trim the branches. But all of those things need to be done in conjunction with the Act, which specifies the size of the tree and what you can do. And if there are any queries people have in this regard, or they want any additional signposting, I would absolutely encourage them to get in touch, either via the DEFA Minister at gov.im email address, or equally via any of the other DEFA email inboxes for arboriculture that I don't know off the top of my head that would be on the internet. Our officers are always keen to signpost people and would be happy to provide any specific information, because there are a number of different ways in which trees can be sited, and it can become quite complex.
To question 12, call the Honourable Member for Ramsden, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Health and Social Care whether she believes Manx Care can come in on the budget set out in the 5-year financial plan in the 2024 Pink Book for both this and the next financial year without impacting frontline services.
Call on the Minister for Health and Social Care to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for Ramsey for the opportunity to reply to this question, and I recognise that there remains quite a lot of concern. Manx Care continues to face significant challenges in bringing its expenditure back in line with the budget for this financial year. In my first week, I have held initial meetings with both the Chair of Manx Care and the Chief Executive, and it is clear that Manx Care remains committed to rigorous budgetary control at every level of the organisation. The Board is committed to ensuring that the measures identified to bring Manx Care closer to balance in 2024-25 deliver. However, it is very difficult to say at this point whether Manx Care will be able to come in on budget. Some measures to reduce the forecast overspend, such as reducing the number of elective theatre lists, do have the potential to affect frontline services. Although at this point they have not had an impact to date, these are being monitored closely. I want to stress that there are no further plans that would impact on frontline services, other than what has already been announced. For next year, it is essential that the services that Manx Care must deliver under its mandate from the Department align with the money available. The collaborative work between the Department and Manx Care to develop a mandate and operating plan for the next financial year that align with the financial plan in the Pink Book is underway, and this remains a priority for the Department. A timetable for that work has been provided to Honourable Members, and I remain committed to those timescales and continuing to engage with members in this work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. Towards the end of her answer, she said that the work is underway to make sure that services for next year align with the financial plan in the Pink Book. That's, again, interesting language, but what concerns me the most about this, Mr. Speaker, is I've asked the Chief Minister this question about 6 times, and at no point was he able to give me a straight answer. I'm now asking the new Minister for Health the same question, and again, I've not been given an answer here. Does she believe Manx Care are capable of coming in on budget this year or next year without impacting frontline services? It is a straightforward question. And the concern I have, Mr. Speaker, is seeing as we now have 2 members of the Council of Ministers, the Chief Minister and the Minister for Health, simply unable to make that confirmation, leads me to infer that, in fact, it is not possible to come in on budget without impacting frontline services.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can understand the member's frustration here. The priority will be to maintain the level of services that people rely on and ensure value for money. Between the Department and Manx Care, we're fully committed to exploring all possible options to achieve that. This includes identifying more efficiencies in how services are run and seeking additional funding opportunities and prioritising resources where they are most needed. Reducing services is not our preferred path, and we will exhaust every alternative before considering such measures. We have now allocated some additional financial support to Manx Care to assist with their cost improvement plans and to support the wider team in relation to financial discipline. Mr. Speaker, I am not unable to give a yes or no answer. It is my choice that I do not give this arbitrary answer at this point. The Honourable Member requires this, but I can reassure him that I am and Manx Care are reviewing this with laser focus. And as soon as I am able to update the Honourable Members, I will do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Question, Mr. Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My surprise with the initial answer was it was comfortable rather than reassuring. With regard to the meetings, was the Minister clear with regard to her expectations? And could she provide more details, please? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and absolutely. I've taken the time to receive briefings from the Department and also, as I mentioned, with meetings with Manx Care Chair Wendy Reid and also Teresa Cope this week. My focus for those meetings was to go over everything that had been implemented by the previous Health and Social Care Minister. And I can say that I was very reassured with the actions that they were taking and as I said, I hope that members will be too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to thank the Minister for confirming that she can't actually state that she believes this is achievable. She cannot state that Manx Care can come in on budget without impacting services, and I think we all know what that means. But one of her remarks that caught me by a little bit by surprise was that she was also exploring additional funding sources. Now, when I've asked the Chief Minister this question in the past, he has quite robustly confirmed that there were no plans to introduce new charges across the services. He, in fact, made that abundantly clear, and I remember him stating only if the previous minister had that work underway, which we all know I didn't. Is the new minister now confirming that that position has changed a week into her appointment, that the department is now looking at the introduction of new charges for new services, as she did mention those additional funding sources in her answer?
Minister.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I'm unable to give a yes or no answer. I haven't said either way at this point. So I do appreciate that the Minister's trying to get something from me, but I can't give that answer yes or no currently at this moment. And currently right now, there are no plans that he is suggesting to make cutting costs in elsewhere that he is suggesting. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister in her answer stated there's no further plans from what has been announced. So we all know what's been announced to this point in time. However, can she reassure the Honourable House and the Manx public that there'll be no stealth introductions in services without it being announced? Particularly if she could look at dental services in that area. And also, the Minister said in her response that she would be looking at efficiencies on how to run services. Can the Minister please confirm that she, in her meetings with both the Chair of Manx Care and also the CEO, that the professionals will be involved in those decisions and not just the layers of management?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So Manx Care is working to provide a costed draft operating plan for 2025 to 26 by the end of December 24. So due to the lack of data available, this will be done on an estimated basis. The intention with this, in this is that delivery of the core services remains as currently stipulated within the mandate. The debate and discussion during the November sitting of Tynwald was extremely helpful and is being fed into the work to align with the mandate and Manx Care's operating plan. In answer to the last question regarding the professionals, absolutely, I can check that, but I'm absolutely certain that they would be consulted on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr Hooper, supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So I'm just trying to get some clarity here. So the Minister has confirmed that she doesn't know whether she believes Manx Care can come in on budget. She doesn't know whether they can do that without impacting on frontline services. That's really reassuring to hear. She's also said that whilst there are no plans to introduce new charges, she is also looking at additional funding sources. So which of those two statements is true? Either you are looking at new funding sources or you're not. That you can't have it both ways, Minister. And I would like to ask the Minister as well if she is aware that any charges for any services provided under the National Health Act must be prescribed by regulations, and they must come through Tynwald Court. So actually, the Department of Manx Care do not have the freedom to set charges themselves unilaterally. So if she is looking to introduce any charges for any aspects of services provided by the National Health Service, is she aware that would have to come through the Tynwald process?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm trying to understand. If he could he just repeat, because he said he was going to make it clear, but he kind of spoke a great deal lot there. Can you just make your question exactly clear to me? Thank you.
If you would care to repeat the essence of your question.
I'm happy to provide some clarity, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has both said she is looking at additional funding sources and not planning any new charges. Which of those statements is true? They cannot both be true. And is she aware that any charges for any services provided under the National Health Service Act must come via regulation, via Tynwald, and so Manx Care and the Department don't have the flexibility to introduce those charges by themselves?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the honourable member for just coming back to me with that. So we are currently not looking for additional funding sources. Currently, Manx Care are looking with laser focus into how to bring it back to balance. And with regards to additional charges, as I confirmed, there are none currently at the moment. And yes, I do agree with the honourable member. He would certainly have far more knowledge than I would in that they would need to come through Tynwald. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr Thomas, supplementary.
Thank you very much. If it might be helpful for the general listener listen to this, can the Minister confirm that funding sources, even additional funding sources, are not necessarily increased or new charges. For instance, there might well be a contingency pot in the department which could be a new funding source because it has to be allocated at some point. And secondly, there are contingency funds for revenue budgets outside the department which could also be used rather than introducing new or additional charges.
Thank you, and I thank the honourable member. Yes, there are contingency funds within the department and also externally within Treasury that could be looked at. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Turn to question 13. Call on the Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for Health and Social Care how many of the 20 doctors whose gross pay is published in written answer W2024011303 are members of A, the British Medical Association, B, the Isle of Man Medical Society, and C, the Isle of Man Medical Society Executive Committee.
Call on the Minister for Health and Social Care to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member will know that I cannot answer this question as neither the department nor Manx Care hold information about the membership of independent professional associations. The British Medical Association is a professional association and registered trade union for doctors and medical students in the UK. The Isle of Man Medical Society is a professional body for doctors in the Isle of Man that advocates for healthcare policies, professional standards and system reforms. The Isle of Man Medical Society Executive Committee is a subgroup within that society. Membership of these organisations is voluntary, unlike registration with the General Medical Council, which is mandatory for doctors practising on the island to ensure accountability and adherence to professional standards. The details of individual memberships is private information that is privy only to the individual and the organisation itself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr Thomas.
Thank you very much. I thought I knew, and I'm glad I did know, and because what I thought is correct. So the information about those top 20 earners amongst medical professionals is private information. Just for the complete clarity then, can the Minister confirm that she doesn't know because she's Minister, and former Ministers wouldn't know because they were once Minister like she is now, and former DHSC members wouldn't know who those 20 people were and whether they were members of either the Isle of Man Medical Society or the British Medical Association?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that I have not seen the named list. It has not been passed to me of the top 20 earners in Manx Care, and I'm unaware of the previous ministers. That would be something I would have to check into, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Mr Thomas.
Thank you very much for this helpful information. I'm just, as a constituency MHK, I've been copied into correspondence that's been ongoing since a statement in the October Tynwald 2024 along the lines of Isle of Man Medical Society members might be vocal, but many times they are also the ones who are playing the system. They are doctors who claim more units of activity than would be feasible or safe for them to have worked. So it seems...
Sorry, Mr Thomas, where are you quoting that from?
From Hansard. Line Hansard is T144 T142295, and that's a straight Hansard quote from that page. At which point I raised a point of order, line 300. Can I just clarify, was that statement then that the people who have been involved representing the clinicians and the healthcare professionals are the ones who are failing, in other words, playing the system? It seems to me that the Minister can confirm today that she has no idea whether the 20 top earners are playing the system and whether they're members of the BMA and members of the Isle of Man Medical Society and the Executive Committee of the Isle of Man Medical Society. So I hope we can move on and that the members of the Isle of Man Medical Society who believe that they were the people who were accused of playing the system now can have reassurance that they're not playing the system and it's wrong for them to be suggested that they were playing the system.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I certainly wouldn't have... I certainly don't know whether those 20 are with the British Medical Association, the Isle of Man Medical Society either, and I'm not sure that other honourable members in this House would too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Minister for this, but if the Minister was to establish that there had been any concerns raised or that honourable members in this place might be aware of that, would the Minister address that accordingly, obviously through Tynwald standards?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I don't know if other members or from the department or the minister prior or ministers prior have been afforded the to see this top 20 earners list. But what I would say is that I will make inquiries to see if that's the case, and if that's the case, then what's the protocol around that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Turn to question 14. Call on the Honourable Member for Albury Castle Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for Infrastructure how much has been spent on scaffolding in each of the last 6 months. Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. In each of the last 6 months, the department has spent the following amount on scaffolding. In May, the department spent £11,890.58. In June 2024, we spent £14,740.58. In July, £9,058.08. In August 2024, £5,730.58. In September 2024, £16,603.80. And in October 2024, £7,113.08. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On to question, Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for producing such a comprehensive list. Is there a specific officer with responsibility for this area, dealing with all the requirements and trying to bring down the costs, or is it simply a cost included within each job? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my department is a wide and varied department, and so the different divisions have different needs for scaffolding at different times and for different purposes. However, all scaffolding services are procured in line with financial regulations, and we don't yet operate a select list for scaffolding services. We haven't progressed that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Minister gave us various figures for the last 6 months there. Clearly, one area that we've all been interested in here is Tramway Terrace. I take it that is included in that, or is that being paid for out of a minor capital or a capital fund?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question was about the cost of scaffolding, and Tramway Terrace scaffolding is included in those figures.
On to question, Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has been made with regard to the scaffolding costs by the department in the last 3 years? As we've seen in the last 6 months, it's over £60,000. It's quite a large sum, as it's actually being looked at as a specific area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware that any review of scaffolding costs across the last 3 years has been carried out.
Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister confirm that it's for the whole of the public estate, the costs that she's indicated today?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that these costs are for the Department of Infrastructure, which was what I was asked about.
And supplementary, Mr Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of the scaffolding that does appear around government buildings does seem to be there for a considerable amount of time, compared with scaffolding that is placed around private buildings. The recent example of the Railway Inn, where it was up and gone in moments. Is that considered in terms of how long the actual scaffolding is required for when we actually go out to procurement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, when we go out to procurement, we go out with knowledge of what we're trying to achieve with scaffolding. I can confirm that scaffolding is done for various purposes. Sometimes it is to support buildings, and some of those projects take longer. Sometimes it is very temporary indeed, and is done merely for access. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thomas.
Thank you very much. Does the department have a policy on whether it should hire scaffolding or purchase scaffolding? Because I think it's quite widely known that the Manx Development Corporation proudly owns quite a lot of scaffolding.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to hear the Manx Development Corporation owns their scaffolding. I'm not aware that my department has a policy, but I can ask.
Turn to question 15. Call on the Honourable Member for Hamilton, Mr Hooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office what evidence was reviewed prior to producing the Council of Ministers' review of the Gas Regulation Prevention of Disconnection Order 2024, and if he will make a statement.
The Minister for the Cabinet Office to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The aim of the review by Council and Ministers of the Gas Regulation Prevention of Disconnection Order 2024 was to consider the impact of Isle of Man Energy's vulnerability commitment as per the February 2024 Tynwald resolution and whether enough was being done to protect vulnerable energy customers. As part of the review, Cabinet Office engaged with key stakeholders including CURA, the Office of Fair Trading and the Social Security Division of Treasury. The engagement sought to understand whether there was any evidence that an amendment to the order might be appropriate to provide increased protection to vulnerable customers, such as increasing the protection to certain vulnerable households to all year round, or broadening the definition of what we mean by vulnerable customers. Through this engagement, there was no strong evidence provided that an amendment to the order was required. There was also no indications that the order has not been effective in protecting vulnerable households and customers from disconnection over the winter period. However, the review does acknowledge that the order has not been in operation since the 31st of March or for a full winter period, so evidence was limited. As a result, there will be ongoing engagement with key stakeholders over the winter period, the first full winter the order will have been in operation. Monitoring impact will ensure that the order is effective, so should any evidence arise that we are alerted to this and we can consider whether a review of the scope of the order is required. I understand the Honourable Member's point in wanting to see evidence, and in normal circumstances a review would be undertaken in response to a situation where there is evidence that an issue needs reviewing. However, on this occasion, the review was undertaken in response to a Tynwald resolution, and whilst undertaking that review, no strong evidence was found that the measures put in place have been ineffective. As I previously mentioned, this will be monitored over the winter period to ensure any issues are identified at an early stage and any appropriate action can be taken as a result. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
One question, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer and for openly acknowledging that there isn't actually any evidence in the review, which is quite clear from reading it directly. What concerns me, though, is the way the review was undertaken. It asks a number of questions, quite rightly. For example, it asks around who is the desired target group. These are one of the things that CURA suggested needs to be considered. So the review says we should figure out who is the target and what the changes might mean to those targets. The problem is the review document doesn't then go on to answer that question. It doesn't actually go on to answer any of the questions that were raised. It simply says, these are the questions CURA said we should ask, and we've concluded that there's no evidence that says we need to change anything. There's a massive gap in between being told these are the questions you should ask and drawing a conclusion. Those questions have not been asked, Mr Speaker, and they certainly haven't been answered in the document. Can the Minister explain how they've managed to make the massive cognitive leap from being told these are the questions you should ask to immediately deciding that actually everything in the order is fine?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And as I say, I think the big issue is that we haven't had the order in operation for a winter period yet. So identifying those groups that are actually going to be the most impacted is very hard to do when you haven't actually had that. What I would say, Mr Speaker, is we go off the evidence that's there. My understanding is that Isle of Man Energy has confirmed that since the order actually came into effect and its own vulnerability commitment was created, it's actually disconnected just one household registered as a priority customer. And that was actually outside, of course, of the winter period. So the important thing, I think, from my point of view, certainly, is that we keep this order under review as we go into the winter period, and then we can actually do a proper gap analysis to actually see if there is any gaps in the order that actually need to be closed.
Question, Mr Thomas.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I thought at one point that you just consulted Treasury, Social Security, OFT and CURA, but you have engaged with Isle of Man Energy as well. Can the Minister just confirm that? Because obviously Isle of Man Energy has had a vulnerability commitment for many years before it published its vulnerability commitment. Secondly, you can't actually complain to CURA or the OFT using this order. You have to go to your local bobby and talk to him at your local police station. So can the Minister undertake to actually go and do a full-scale investigation of all of the police officers around the Isle of Man and Constabulary headquarters to find out if anybody went into any of the police stations who was frustrated because they weren't covered in the order, because that's what you actually have to do under this order. I mean, it makes more sense to go and ask CURA, to go and ask Isle of Man Energy under their commitment but I think that point was made at the time.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am not going to make a commitment, which I'm sure the Chief Constable will be very relieved to hear if he's listening to this, to go around interviewing his police officers to find out if anyone's approached individual officers. The Office of Fair Trading has very good engagement with Isle of Man Energy, and my understanding from the Office of Fair Trading as well is that they have confirmed that the number of complaints made is significantly reduced since the order came into operation that they've received. So although I appreciate what the members saying about the actual order itself, you would still be seeing people complain to the Office of Fair Trading as well if that was the case. In terms of the Honourable Member's other point, yes, there has of course been engagement with Isle of Man Energy as well, and it is important that engagement continues as the supplier.
Mr. Hooper, supplementary question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is somewhat concerning that the government's position on this is we're not going to act until someone has already suffered harm. That's the point. We'll wait for someone to suffer harm. That will give us the evidence we need to then change the law. What's interesting for me around this particular stance, though, is this idea of Manx exceptionalism, that somehow people living on the Isle of Man are so totally different from people living in other jurisdictions. The jurisdictional comparison in the document itself actually highlights that the UK, for example, through Ofgem, do protect other categories of vulnerable people. For example, people with a long-term physical or mental health condition, people who may need to have a warm house for medical reasons. They are actually protected in the UK. They are not protected by our regulation. They're not protected by this order. What consideration was given by the Cabinet Office in its detailed review to actually protecting these people on the Isle of Man, or is it the government's position that people with a long-term physical or mental health condition do not need such protection on the Isle of Man?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member himself many times stands up in this House and says that things should be evidence-based, and that's exactly what we're looking to do. At the moment, there is no evidence that this order actually needs to be expanded in that way. As I have said to the Honourable Member, if any evidence does emerge that needs to happen, but if you go back and look at the statistics around the disconnections, we're not seeing that evidence either. So I would say to the Honourable Member that it is important that anything we do is evidence-based, and also from my point of view, one of the important things we try to do is where people are finding themselves in difficulties in being able to pay for their energy supply, that we look to get them help and support in that regard and point them in the appropriate direction.
Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister keeps talking about the winter period. Can he advise what he classes as his winter period? Because this legislation's been in since January last year, yet he can't give us any data. And obviously, if you Google, like the Treasury Minister did earlier, the winter period is advised as December the 21st. So, therefore, why hasn't the Minister got any data?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The winter period is defined in the order.
Mr. Morehouse, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A key aspect of this order is to protect the vulnerable. Are any reminders being issued and checks being made to ensure these people are now on the relevant registers as priority customers to ensure the legislation is actually effective? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Honourable Member for Arbury Castan Malou makes a very good point, and it's a good opportunity for me to put on the record as well that if anyone feels they do fall into those vulnerable categories, do get in touch with Isle of Man Energy and get yourself registered. It's very hard to identify everyone, particularly people who haven't identified themselves, but I would make the public call again here in this honourable place, Mr. Speaker, that if anyone feels they do fall within the vulnerable categories, get in touch with Isle of Man Energy and get yourself registered on the register. Or, of course, the Office of Fair Trading as well.
Question, Ms. Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's answer was the winter period is defined in the order. Can the Minister state what that winter period is? That's what I asked him to do.
Minister's reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From memory, and it is from memory, I believe the winter period is defined as between November and March, I think.
Supplementary question, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, it brings me back down to this question of evidence. We know there is evidence that people suffer poor health outcomes when they need a constant heat supply and lose access to it. That's It's self-evident, and I'm sure that Ofgem in the UK have a wealth of evidence to back up their policy that protects these vulnerable people. The fact that the Cabinet Office Minister is insisting on having local evidence from local people to support a policy indicates he believes that Manx people are in some way physiologically different to those living in the United Kingdom, and therefore we need our own special set of evidence. But bringing me back to that question of evidence, I would like to ask the Minister a question. In his conclusion to this review, it states that the order offers the minimum legislative protections necessary to safeguard vulnerable people who would be at risk of poor health outcomes as a result of disconnection from gas supply. That statement is self-evidently not accurate because the order provides no protections for people who are in need of a constant gas supply because of a health condition. So can he confirm then why the review concludes something that the order, in his own words, quite categorically, doesn't actually do?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. All I can repeat to the Honourable Member is that, like I say, at the moment, the review of the order found that, that it is adequate. There is no evidence to suggest at the moment that that is inadequate. We will be monitoring it over the winter period, and if any such evidence emerges, then we can act very swiftly to amend that order. I do want to actually put on record, Mr. Speaker, I said to the Honourable Member November, I think, in my previous answer. I should have said October. It's October to March, the winter period. But the review has concluded. We have done the review in line with the Tynwald resolution. As I said in my original answer, in normal circumstances, you wouldn't actually review something until there is evidence that a review is required. We have done so from the to comply with the Tynwald resolution, but as we go into the winter period, we will be very much keeping an eye on this to see what the real impact is, because at the end of the day, that's what's important.
Final supplementary, Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that as only 20,000 of the 43,000 properties in the Isle of Man have their heating and their hot water from gas, and that's a decreasing number as well, it seems, and that it could be that people who, the other 20,000 who get it from oil, and the 3,000 who take the risk with alternative energy sources and electricity, could this be part of wider investigation of the problems of lack of hot water and heating in homes around the Isle of Man, and Cabinet Office coordinate that rather than just reviewing and picking on one particular private sector provider in the gas sector? Minister Trappai.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's not picking on one provider. I must point that out. The actual order is the Gas Regulation Prevention of Disconnections Order 2024. The clue's in the name, gas. That is what came forward. That is what the Tynwald resolution asked us to review, and that's what the question is on today. I'm not going to give any wider commitments here today, Mr. Speaker.
So to question 16, calling the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the political member of the Communications and Regulatory Authority what input the Communications and Utilities Regulatory Authority provided into the Council of Ministers review of the Gas Regulation Prevention and Disconnection Order 2024.
I want a political member of the Communications and Regulatory Authority, Mrs. Corlett, to reply.
Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his question. I apologise in advance if my answer is a bit long-winded. That's not my usual style, but I do wish to provide the clearest information that I can in this matter. There is a requirement in the Gas Regulation Act 1995 that Council of Ministers consult with the authority prior to making any regulations in respect of customers being disconnected from the gas network. I can confirm that Cabinet Office consulted with the authority on behalf of the Council of Ministers as required, and that the discussions between the two organisations were frank and productive. Furthermore, the authority's observations were taken on board by Cabinet Office while making its decision. The authority raised three main issues during its engagement with the Cabinet Office. Firstly, it raised the potential risk to the business, specifically that any measure adopted should consider whether it would place an undue burden on the business and put the gas supply at risk. The authority noted that it made provisions in the regulatory framework through an allowance for bad debts and a retail margin to compensate for risks such as these. It was also noted that the authority felt that the measures being proposed by the Council of Ministers would be offset by these allowances. It was also pointed out that vulnerable being used, the definition of and the proportionate definition of vulnerable being used, and that the wider the definition in the regulations becomes, the more likely it would be that the authority would have to revisit the allowances that I've already mentioned. The authority also pointed out the risk of creating perverse incentives. In this case, incentivising people not to pay their bills. Disconnections, particularly during winter, is an emotive issue. And rightly so. However, the primary goal of the disconnection is not to punish, it's to prevent a customer from getting further and further into debt. Disconnection is never pleasant, but it is sometimes necessary. If customers are incentivised to put off paying their bills, it can lead to greater hardship down the road, finding themselves in far worse position. To alleviate these risks while protecting the vulnerable customers, the authority advised that the eligibility for protection is set as narrowly as possible, while still achieving the policy objective. Lastly, the authority advised that the Gas Economic Regulation Bill, which is currently being drafted, will deal with the issues of disconnection and vulnerable users through licence conditions and other regulatory tools. These measures would obviously be in keeping with prevailing public policy on such matters. The focus will remain on protecting vulnerable customers, especially at the time when their gas supply is most needed, and ensuring their fair and proportional treatment by the gas supplier. The authority concluded that there was no strong evidence to suggest that the order needed to be revised, especially as it had not been in place through an entire winter season. In such circumstances, changes may well weaken the protection as strengthen it. There is also nothing to prohibit changes being made at any point should there be evidence that it should be necessary. I think that in closing, Mr. Speaker, it should be noted that the prevention of disconnections brought about by this order does not prevent a customer from incurring debt or address the reasons why they may be facing disconnection in the first place. I would encourage anybody who may have difficulty affording their gas bill to talk to Isle of Man Energy or to the authority, which is absolutely willing to help wherever it can. There are also third sector organisations which may be able to assist people who are facing financial difficulties. Please don't remain silent. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I do note that that answer was over 3 minutes, which is the guidance, and there are provisions in standing orders for the circulation of lengthy answers. I just remind honourable members of that. Supplementary question, Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for that quite lengthy answer. In it, she mentioned that Cura raised 3 very specific questions when they were responding to the consultation from the Cabinet Office. Can the member advise whether Cura felt that the review document itself actually answered any of those questions? And if so, if she can point me to where in the review document those questions were answered.
Member for Cura to reply.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have that information with me, but I really am happy to take that back and circulate it to the honourable member, to all members, once I receive it. Thank you.
Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, and I thought that was a very helpful intervention from the member who represents the public and politicians on the Cura board. In that answer, I think there was reference to the proposed bill, and talk about a statement last week. I just quickly looked at the Cura page. Perhaps I missed something. Could the member take to circulate further details about what statement was made last week in respect to the bill? Because I, for one, am looking forward to greatly to hear consultation, feedback, response on the Gas Economic Regulation Bill and the extent to which it includes consumer protection, because I think that will be very, very important to know for us all.
Member to reply.
Well, firstly, Mr. Speaker, I didn't mention any statement, but I am very happy to circulate, Cura are very happy to circulate the information that the member requires. Thank you.
Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The review document actually includes an interesting statement which is attributed to Cura. It reads, Cura is of the view there are unlikely to be further problems arising over winter because of the protections provided from the order. So is that Cura's position then, that all the vulnerable people that are needing to be protected are in fact protected by the order? The reason I ask this is because Isle of Man Energy's vulnerability commitment goes far broader than the order itself. They actually protect people, as I've said a number of times, with long-term health needs under their voluntary policy, which could be withdrawn at a moment's notice. So is it the regulator's position that the order which doesn't protect these people does in fact somehow protect these people, or is that statement that's been included in the review document on behalf of Cura slightly misleading?
Member to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People who fall outside the scope of the order are not protected by it. That's not to say that there are not people out there who may need support of one type or another, but that's a separate issue and that needs to be dealt with through social welfare. This order, though necessary, it's not a silver bullet, and it's not a long-term fix, even for the people who are covered by it. It's a short-term measure designed to protect the most vulnerable in our society for a short period of time. It is not intended to be a replacement for social welfare.
So it's supplementary. Mr Ashford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the member for Cura agree that if Ireland Man Energy changed their vulnerability commitment at any point, then of course the order could be reviewed and changed?
Member to reply.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I totally agree.
Mr Thomas.
Thank you, but does the member further agree that the best way to do this is through the standard approach of a regulatory licence membership arrangement, and this order was always daft as an approach. It's not as anywhere else around these parts, and as soon as we get to proper gas regulation from Cura, the better we all are.
Member to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the honourable member is absolutely correct in what he says.
Supplementary. Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member has just summed up her position and Cura's position by stating that the order protects the most vulnerable in our society. I think it is quite self-evidently the case that the order does no such thing. The order protects a very limited subset of vulnerable people on the island. It does not protect those, for example, with long-term health needs. It does not protect pregnant women. It does not protect people who are covered by the vulnerability commitment. So, given that Cura are the ones going to be reforming this process and introducing these sorts of protections through licence conditions, can the member please provide me with some assurance that actually they will not just be looking to rehash the limitations of the existing order in those licence conditions when they come forward as part of a more proper regulatory framework around gas?
Member to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I would like to ask the honourable member is if he would come and speak to Cura about his issues with the new legislation, because we're happy to talk to members about that. And what the honourable member is asking is in many ways is a policy matter, and the authority tries to avoid straying into the policy debate. However, I think it is fair to point out that no measure is without its costs, and good policy seeks to deliver on its goals while minimising the cost to society. And that is likely why regulators in other jurisdictions have tried to set out the minimum level of protection that would apply and allows other forces, such as competition, goodwill, to drive any additional protection. We can see that the protections put in place by companies typically goes further than what's mandated, and that is the case here. And I think at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we have to remember that every measure, no matter how necessary or how noble, comes at a cost.
Supplementary. Ms Edge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister might not have this answer, but I just wonder, whilst they're looking at anything, Cura, whether they could look at a way that a register for all vulnerable across all energy providers could be something that could be implemented so that it's not just gas that we have a vulnerable register.
Member to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that may be outside of the Cura remit, but I'm happy to take it back to the board and discuss it.
Thank you. That concludes questions for oral answer this morning. We turn to item 2 on the order paper, Income Tax Bill 2024, and I call on Dr Allenton to move.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This short bill confirms one temporary taxation order and makes a number of minor amendments to the Income Tax Act 1970. A temporary taxation order is used by the Treasury to amend and introduce primary income tax legislation. It's mainly used to react quickly to international changes or to introduce measures for the budget. The order has the same power as primary statute and has immediate effect once approved by Tynwald. However, it will cease to have effect within 12 months of the day in which it was approved by Tynwald, unless this House reads a bill confirming the order for a second time. Furthermore, royal assent is required within 24 months of the day of which the temporary taxation order was approved by Tynwald. The temporary taxation order confirmed by this bill was approved by Tynwald as part of the 2024 budget. It amends references to supplementary charges on unauthorised payments and calculations based on 20% in light of the increase to the prescribed rate. Instead of substituting 22% for 20%, the amendments where possible have been made to that of the percentage equal to the prescribed rate of income tax. This approach means that further changes will not be required when the prescribed rate of income tax changes in the future. This approach was not possible in respect of one amendment, and therefore in Section 50 of the Income Tax Act 1989, the percentage is being amended directly. In addition, an amendment to Section 2 of the Income Tax Act 1970 in respect of income on which tax is payable ensures the legislation is clear that employment income of non-residents is taxed based on where the employment duties are performed. Furthermore, the temporary taxation order also inserted a new section 119BA into the Income Tax Act 1970 in respect of petroleum extraction activities or rights to provide for the computing of income from such activities or rights. The bill also makes 12 amendments to the Income Tax Act 1970. 5 of the 12 amendments are in respect of correcting references, and 3 make textual amendments to update the references to the repealed Data Protection Act 2002. An amendment to Section 39C ensures that where a person starts to cohabit during a tax year, the additional allowance can be apportioned accordingly. Finally, Section 80G5 is amended to make the definition in that subsection consistent with other Manx legislation. A formatting irregularity in Section 106C is corrected, and in Section 120, paragraph H of the definition of tax position is substituted to ensure all international standards are encompassed. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the Income Tax Bill 2024 be read for a second time.
On the Honourable Member for Garth, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Put the question that the Income Tax Bill 2024 be read for a second time. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We turn then to consideration of clauses and the Treasury Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2024. Go on, Dr. Allinson to move.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With the House's permission, I propose to move clauses 1 and 2 together.
Is that agreed, honourable members?
Agreed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clauses 1 and 2 are introductory. Clause 1 provides the resultant act with its short title. Clause 2 provides for the bill to be brought into force when royal assent is given. Since the bill was read a second time in this Honourable House, discussions have been ongoing as to whether the commencement of this act should be modified. The Treasury is keen to be able to use some of the measures provided by the bill at the earliest opportunity, in particular the fees provision in Part 5. Other measures are anticipatory, providing for powers that are not intended to be used for the time being. The rounding provision in Part 3 of the bill is probably the most representative of this type of measure, as it provides for a new power rather than modifying powers that already exist. Having considered matters raised by honourable members, the Treasury has taken the view that the Act itself should still be brought into force at the earliest opportunity, but amendments will be proposed where appropriate to make the commencement of a particular provision subject to a secondary legislative process, meaning it cannot come into effect without Tynwald debating the merits of doing so. Therefore, the government amendment tabled for Clause 9 provides for the rounding provision to come into effect following the making of regulations, subject to Tynwald's approval. In these circumstances, it was seen as an unnecessary duplication to also provide for an appointed day order to be laid before Tynwald following the approval of the said regulations by Tynwald. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clauses 1 and 2 stand part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second and reserve my remarks.
Mr. Thomas.
But there are other sections which will not come into operation unless there's specific Tynwald approval for them. Thank you.
Put the question that clauses 1 and 2 stand past the bill. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 3.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Part 2 of the bill relates to auditing matters and comprises clauses 3 to 8. Clause 3 introduces amendments to the Audit Act 2006. Subclause 2 amends Section 1.1 of the Audit Act 2006 to include the general revenue, the Reserve Fund and the Consolidated Loans Fund under the Isle of Man Loans Act 1974 within the scope of the Audit Act 2006. This has the effect to ensure that these are within the Tynwald Auditor General's remit. It also removes the requirement for separate audited accounts in respect of these funds. Subclause 3 amends Section 4A1 of the Audit Act 2006, which provides for the wording to be used by inspectors to describe the successful outcome of an assurance review or examination carried out under the said Act. The wording is currently not compatible with the professional standards that inspectors must comply with by statute. This subclause seeks to rectify this by aligning the statutory wording to the applicable professional standards. It also provides the flexibility of undertaking an assurance review or an examination of accounts prepared on either an income and expenditure basis or a receipts and payments basis. Subclause 4 amends Section 12 so that the regulations made under said section are framed so it can be said that the accounts inspected under the Audit Act 2006 either give a true and fair view or properly present the financial affairs of the body, the relevant body for the period, or at the date to which they relate. This change of wording takes into account that the accounts may be prepared on an income and expenditure basis or receipts and payment basis in line with the previous subclause. Subclause 5 amends Section 13.2 so that it refers to Section 88 of the Interpretation Act 2015 rather than the now repealed Section 26.4 of the Interpretation Act 1976. Subclause 6 inserts the definition of the Reserve Fund in the Interpretation section of the Audit Act 2006. This definition is currently not provided for, and its insertion seeks to clarify that the expression Reserve Fund encompasses all reserve funds relating to the activities of the Isle of Man Government. The provisions of this bill intend to resolve some very specific issues that the Tynwald Auditor General raised with the Treasury. It should be noted these issues were raised long before the completion of Mr Auditor's report, Public Audit in the Isle of Man, laid before Tynwald this past July. The Treasury has noted Mr Auditor's recommendations, totalling approximately 100, and cross-referenced them with the clause of the bill in the explanatory notes. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 3 stands part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
Mr Thomas.
Just 2 points. The first one is that in the exposition of the clause, the Treasury Minister didn't include, in respect of the Reserve Fund, didn't include the line in accordance with proper practices in respect of other funds, other reserves that are managed and recognised in accordance with proper practices. Is it valid to have as a working assumption that every fund that's mentioned in the Pink Book, say, is a fund that can now be audited as long as proper practices are followed? And would the Treasury Minister expand a little bit more about what proper practices are? And secondly, I think I want to compliment and congratulate the Treasury and Treasury Minister AGs, because I think what we've got here is we've got proper treatment of audit under a Treasury miscellaneous provisions bill, and I think we can expect a much longer Audit Act Amendment Bill to come at a later stage following all of the recommendations from the Tynwald Auditor General. So I just want to my understanding to be confirmed such that we can expect proper consultation with all auditors about what the subsequent Audit Act amendments might be and how that will be progressed.
Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I suppose the question I have for the Treasury Minister is, what about all those accounts that have been audited and signed off to date? So looking at some of the changing here is changing terminology, changing language. Some of it is changing, looks to be changing the actual requirements. So instead of satisfying himself or herself, somebody must be reasonably satisfied. That is a slight difference. It is definitely more aligned with professional standards that I'm familiar with. But my understanding is those professional standards have been around for quite some time. So looking back through previous sets of audited accounts, the Treasury has been in receipt of a number of audit reports over the years which quite clearly state, in the auditor's opinion, things are true and fair, or that these accounts have been prepared in accordance with the Audit Act 2006 and the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2018. But it looks like that may not actually be the case, because we're changing the language in the Act now to bring it up to date, to make sure the Act is now compliant with practice. So can the Treasury Minister just confirm, does this mean that those previous audit reports may not have actually been compliant if they were following best practice and international best practice as opposed to the legislation, because the wording in those reports seems to reflect best practice rather than the old-fashioned and outdated language in the Act and the regulation. So just some clarity on what do these changes actually mean in practice for any of those audit reports that have already been signed off and laid in front of Tynwald. Thank you.
On the mover to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank both honourable members for their comments. Again, in the clause in question, we're looking at the General Revenue and Reserve Fund coming in, which was one of the requests of the Tynwald Auditor General going forward, that this would be a comprehensive way of auditing all these funds under one regime rather than separate. In terms of the Honourable Member for Ramsey's question, I thank him for his comments. Certainly the previous audited reports are compliant. What we're trying to do now is link best practice with statute going forward at the request of the Auditor General, so that our legislation is brought up to date, and also his ability to audit government accounts is made as clear as possible. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With that, I beg to move.
Put the question that clause 3 stand past the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 4, Dr. Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 4 amends the Freedom of Information Act 2015 so that the accounts of the Isle of Man Information Commissioner are inspected under the Audit Act 2006 rather than audited. This particular wording widens the range of scrutiny options for these accounts, as inspection includes but is not limited to audit. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 4 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beg to second.
Question that clause 4 stand past the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 5, Dr. Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 5 introduces amendments to the Tynwald Auditor General Act 2011. Subclause 2 repeals Section 5F Tynwald Auditor General Act 2011 as a consequence of the repeal of Section 4 of the Finance Act 1958 provided for by Clause 7 of this bill. Subclause 3A amends paragraph 11 of the Schedule 1 to the Tynwald Auditor General Act 2011 so that it refers to Section 69(3) of the Interpretation Act 2015 rather than the now repealed Section 26(3) of the Interpretation Act 1976. Subclause 3B amends paragraph 17(2) of the Schedule 1 to the Tynwald Auditor General Act so that the accounts of the Tynwald Auditor General be inspected under the Audit Act 2006 rather than audited. This particular wording widens the range of scrutiny options for these accounts, as inspection includes but is not limited to audit. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 5 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second.
Put the question that clause 5 stand past the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 6, Dr. Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 6 amends the Financial Services Act 2008 so that the accounts of the Isle of Man Financial Services Authority are inspected under the Audit Act 2006 rather than audited. This particular wording widens the range of scrutiny options for these accounts. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 6 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second.
Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much. The change from inspected from audited happens 3 times, and I wanted to leave it to the last one, but was teased each time because there was no more information about the extra activities that were included now that were not included before. So perhaps the Minister could use this as an opportunity to summarise the extra approaches or activities that are now included that weren't previously included. For instance, does it include the ability to direct the body in question? So, for instance, could Treasury tell the Freedom of Information Commissioner that they can't spend money on this sort of thing, and so on? What are the extra activities that are included in this wider definition of inspection rather than auditing?
Super.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a very similar question, actually. So audit tends to be viewed as the highest level of assurance. So that's an audit. Then you go down to things like inspections and examinations and reviews. And so changing the language here implies that we are going to be accepting a lessening of the amount of assurance that we may wish to have in certain circumstances. So I'd really appreciate some real clarity from the Treasury on why they think that giving us more flexibility, that sounds great, but actually what this means is giving you the flexibility to have a lower level of assurance, and that is something that would concern me somewhat. So if the Treasury Minister could explain why it is beneficial to have a lower level of assurance, I'd be happy to support this particular change, but if not, I think it's something that should be quite strongly resisted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to reassure members, this is not giving powers to Treasury. This is giving flexibility to the Tynwald Auditor General and audit in general. The Audit Act 2006 already provides for 3 levels of inspections for public accounts, as the Honourable Member for Ramsey has stated. So these already exist in terms of audit, which is the most in-depth level of inspection, assurance review, and examination, which is perhaps the most simpler form of inspection. The generally accepted practice is to choose the level of an inspection in line with the level of risk associated with the accounts to be inspected. The more complex the accounts, the higher the risk, and therefore the higher the level of inspection, and also the higher the cost of that inspection. Indeed, the cost of an inspection depends greatly on the depth the inspector is required to go into and the complexity of the accounts to be inspected. So being able to adjust the level of the inspection is therefore useful to keep the costs down without compromising on the goal, which is to identify issues in the underlying audit. With that, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move.
Question that clause 6 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no.
No.
The ayes have it. Division called. For 3 against. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 7, Dr. Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 7 repeals Section 4 of the Finance Act 1958 as a consequence of the amendments to Section 1.1 of the Audit Act 2006, stated provided for by Clause 3.1 of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 7 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question that clause 7 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 8, Dr. Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this has to be my my favourite clause of this bill. This introduces amendments to the Allotments Act 1928 to reflect current practice. Subclause 1 removes the requirements for separate inspection of the accounts of the allotments committees. Subclause 2 removes the requirement for local authorities to prepare separate accounts in respect of their allotment committees established under this Act, and the requirement for the Department of Infrastructure to lay before Tynwald a summary of the accounts of all allotment committees established under the Act on an annual basis. This aligns with the current practice whereby the allotments activities of a local authority are reflected in the accounts of said local authorities, which is subject to inspection under the Audit Act 2006. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 8 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second.
Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a similar question to what I've asked before. So the Treasury are changing the law to align with what the Treasury Minister has described as current practice. Does that mean then that current practice is not in line with the law? Are we talking about, I know this is a minor matter in the grand scheme of things, allotment committees, but the principle that governments, local or national, should comply with the law, I think, is relatively basic. So is the Treasury Minister saying that the current practice of our allotments committees and local authorities, as overseen by the Treasury, is not complying with the law as it stands, which has necessitated this change? Can we just get some clarity on that?
Move to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the Honourable Member for his question. I unfortunately wasn't around in 1928 when this law was drafted, and certainly in my times with local authorities, I'm not aware of any separate different accounts being presented to Tynwald from allotment committees. So I think he has a valid point that the law that was, the act that was passed in 1928 is now completely outdated and should be reformed. That's what this clause intends to do, to make this far more simple for local authorities to comply with the legislation. In terms of what's happened in the past, I'm not aware of any significant complaints being lodged in terms of the accounts of allotment committees, or actually whether some of these allotment committees are still in existence. But this amendment at the request of the Tynwald Auditor General obviously clarifies this in statute. Thank you, and with that I beg to move Clause 8.
Put the question that Clause 8 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 9, Dr Allinson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Clause 9 introduces the amendments to the Currency Act 1992 necessary to ensure that Treasury has the vires to enact its policy in respect of small coin denominations. This policy was set out in response to the public consultation that was undertaken in 2023 in anticipation of a potential removal of 1p and 2p coins in the distant future. Subsection 2 substitutes the current Section 4 of the Currency Act 1992 to clarify the powers of the Treasury to call in notes and coins in circulation on the island, putting it beyond doubt that it can do so in respect of both Manx and UK legal tender. It also alters the way the Treasury should give notice when considering using the power to require the notice to be published in one newspaper and at least another method deemed appropriate for mass communication to the public of the island, which includes electronic means. To be clear, Treasury's position is not to use this power at the present time. However, the circumstance may change should our neighbours in the adjacent isle decide to progress with their own withdrawal of these coins, and if that situation arises, the Treasury will again revisit the position and is likely to follow suit. Subsection 3 clarifies the power of direction of the Treasury under Section 8 of the Currency Act 1992, putting it beyond doubt that it can do so in respect of both Manx and UK legal tender. Subsection 4 inserts a new Section 10A to the Currency Act 1992, providing for a legal basis for the voluntary rounding of cash transactions to the nearest 5p or multiple of 5p on the part of businesses, retailers and other sellers of goods and providers of services. Following the concerns expressed by members at second reading, and particularly the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper, it became apparent that this particular subsection was drafted in a way that did not necessarily deliver the intended policy objective. Specifically, the commencement of the rounding measure was questioned. As currently drafted, there were concerns that it would allow businesses on island to implement the rounding policy in the coming year, causing an immediate and undesired impact. As there was no intention to facilitate rounding in the near future, and noting the unintended consequences if the provisions were introduced as is, the wording of this particular subsection of the bill was reviewed and revised. I'm grateful to Mr Smith to move a government amendment replacing it with an updated wording focusing the measure on facilitating, where Tynwald agrees that the time is right, a smooth transition towards the withdrawal of low value coins from circulation. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 9 stands part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
We now call on Mr Smith to move amendment number 1.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the proposed amendment replaces the wording of the new Section 10A in the Currency Act 1992 inserted by subsection 4 of the now approved Clause 9. As explained by the Treasury Minister, it seeks to refocus the rounding provision on the original policy aim, to facilitate a smooth transition towards the withdrawal of low-value coins from circulation. Indeed, it may be beneficial to introduce voluntary rounding before these coins are removed from circulation. New subsection 1 makes it clear that the new section 10A only applies to transactions settled in cash and not to transactions settled by electronic means, for example, debit card payment or bank transfer. New subsection 2 provides the Treasury with the power to make regulations setting a rounding reference amount in pence. These regulations will be subject to Tynwald's approval. New subsection 3 explains how, subject to the aforementioned regulation having been made, transactions settled in cash should be rounded to the nearest multiple of the rounding reference amount. Examples given in this subsection are based on the rounding reference amount being set to 5 pence. The process that is envisaged here can be described as follows. Depending on the circumstances at the time, the Treasury will propose to make regulations under the new subsection 2 to set the rounding reference amount. It could be 5p, it could be 10p, it could be 2p. At this point in time, we simply cannot say what would be more beneficial. The proposal will spur a debate in Tynwald. If Tynwald does not feel that it is appropriate to introduce voluntary rounding, then it will not be introduced. If, conversely, Tynwald believes that the measure would be beneficial, then voluntary rounding may be introduced, and the Treasury will provide further guidance to businesses and customers alike on how it should work. Effectively, this new wording makes the introduction of voluntary rounding subject to Tynwald's approval and reaffirms the aim of the Treasury that participation of this measure is not compulsory. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the amendment to clause 9 standing in my name. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mrs. Corwett.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to second.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Treasury for making this change. I think it's definitely an improvement on what was originally drafted. The only question I have for the Minister actually is about the amendment. It's how this interacts with the requirements he talked about to publicise any changes in currency. So the Act requires 1 month's notice, I think the Minister said in 2 newspapers. I get that in terms of small changes for cancellation of particular types of coins or notes, but if you were to decide to, say, remove all of the 2p pieces in existence on the island, that 1 month may not be long enough. And I'd just like to get some assurance, really, that if a decision is made by Treasury, by Tynwald, at some point in the future to withdraw an entire class of coin, for example, a 1p or a 2p piece, that will be done with more than the minimum 1 month's notice that is required by law.
Johnson?
I'm speaking to the amendment. I thank the Honourable Member for MC for his comments. If we do get to the position where the United Kingdom decides to withdraw low denomination coins, we will have that debate about whether we do follow suit. We don't have to, but whether we do follow suit, any transition will absolutely need to take time. And some of the rounding provisions that have been brought in were very much in response to some of the feedback from small and medium-sized businesses on the Isle of Man, who felt that if they were in the situation of needing to round, that they'd want some government advice on how to do it, to try to minimise any arguments they may have with customers. But in terms of the Honourable Member's comments, absolutely, one of the provisions in these amendments is to make sure that there is adequate publicity and adequate time for people to transition to a time in the future where we may not have as many small denomination coins as we presently do.
Give the rights members to sum up. Mr. Smith, you have anything to add?
No, Mr. Speaker, I think it was clear when what I articulated. Thank you very much.
Dr. Allenson, anything further? In which case I put the question that, firstly, Amendment 1 be approved. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. Ayes have it. Have it. Putting to you Clause 9 as amended. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 10, Dr. Allenson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Part 4, the Amendment to Fire Services Act 1985 of the bill, makes a number of revisions to the Fire Services Act 1984, which I will refer to as the 1984 Act. Primarily, the introductions to these provisions will clarify the basis upon which the Department of Home Affairs may make charges. Honourable members will be aware that the Department of Home Affairs have core responsibility for the Isle of Man Fire and Rescue Service. Clause 10 sets out that this part introduces amendments to the 1984 Act. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 10 stands part of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second.
Put the question that Clause 10 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 11, Dr. Allenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 11 amends Section 2 of the 1984 Act to provide the Department of Home Affairs with the power to charge for services in accordance with Section 4 of the 1984 Act. This will clarify the basis upon which the Fire and Rescue Service can make charges. It also provides retrospective statutory footing for charges in respect of certain firefighting activities under Section 4 of the 1984 Act. Mr. Speaker, I understand that the rationale for this amendment to Section 2 of the 1984 Act is that the Department of Home Affairs recognised that the previous application of the Fire and Rescue Services charging policy has been based upon a reasonable interpretation of the law. it has been recognised that Clause 11 will provide a useful clarification which can draw a line under the issue of interpretation of the existing legislation and take the matter beyond legislative doubt. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 11 stand part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
And to amendment number 2, call Mr Hooper to move.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the Treasury Minister for opening this in such an interesting way, talking about the reason for this amendment coming because previous application of policy was done in a reasonable way. I think what he meant to say was the Department of Home Affairs is unable to confirm that it has at all times complied with the law. That's the reality here. I think they have acted in good faith. I've not got any doubts about that. But ultimately, whether or not they have acted in accordance with the law would be a matter for a court to determine, not us here as legislators. And I think that's where I have an issue with the second part of this clause. The first part that says let's introduce a new section to make this policy going forwards clearer and better, I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. But the second part of this clause that says, oh, and by the way, we're going to apply this to anything that's already gone before, that is where I have some real issues and real concerns. Legislating retrospectively is dangerous. It actually should only be done in the most exceptional of circumstances. And I'm not convinced that the government realising that it may have been charging people inappropriately, ultra vires, unlawfully, whatever language you may want to use, it is a good enough reason to apply this retrospectively. It essentially gives the government a get-out-of-jail-free card. Says, look, we may not have been entirely legally compliant, but actually this is okay. And actually, I don't think it is okay. I think if anyone has to comply with the law, the government has to comply with the law. That is a very basic principle, I think, of our democracy, that when the government sets laws, it is incumbent on it to comply with them. And then if the government doesn't comply for whatever reason, then there is a route for the citizenry, people who have been, in this case, charged for services, to actually seek recompense and to seek justice through our court system. That is a system of independent checks and balances that we pride ourselves on. What retrospective application of this clause does is it says, no, we don't really want that independent checks and balances. We want to legislate our way out of the problem. We want to say, let's change the law as of last week, so that everything we did in the past is no longer subject to that judicial challenge, because the new law that we've backdated says everything we did was okay. So I'm not comfortable with that. I think if the government has made mistakes, and they've been genuine, well-intentioned, but they have been mistakes nonetheless, and that someone has lost out as a result, they should be able to come back to the government through the court system and say, actually, that wasn't okay. And they should be able to get justice. That's the way our system works. But backdating a provision that says everything we have done in the past is actually legally fine wipes out people's rights to do that. So that's why I think it's dangerous. That's why the amendment I'm proposing actually removes that retrospective application element of the law. I can understand why the department would like the clarity. I can understand why they want certainty. I can understand why they would want to say this may actually cost the taxpayer some money. If someone were to bring a successful case through the courts, it could cost the department and therefore the taxpayer some money. I accept all of those arguments, but they are not strong enough arguments in my book for us to write off people's ability to seek recompense and to seek a just treatment through the courts. That doesn't seem okay to me. If it ends up costing government money because government has made mistakes, government has to own those mistakes and stand up and say, yep, we got it wrong, and we're going to be quite clear about that. It isn't really for government to say, we think we might have got it wrong, so let's backdate the law, so that the law says, actually, we didn't get it wrong. So I have real issues with this backdating. I also have real issues with it being done now. And the reason for that is because this amendment, in no circumstances, can actually succeed. I say that knowing Mr. Wannenberg is actually absent, so today, by pure chance, the amendment may succeed. We have 10 ministers in the Council of Ministers. We have a member of the DHA and a member of the Treasury, all of whom are bound by collective responsibility to support this bill. That is 12 of them. Without a majority vote, an amendment cannot succeed. So I'm standing up here making this case to say government shouldn't be giving itself a get-out-of-jail-free card, shouldn't be trampling over people's ability to seek justice and recompense, knowing that the government has automatically, before anyone stands up opening its mouth, automatically is going to win this vote because they have 12 members signed up to vote for it. There is no way this amendment could succeed other than the fact that Mr. Wannenberg happens to be absent. And that is absolutely awful. That we're going through a charade of parliamentary democracy today, and that there are amendments here that I know the government are supportive of, and they will succeed. There are amendments that the government are not supportive of, and they will fail. There is quite honestly no purpose in me standing up and making the case to protect the rights of individuals, to try and stop us from supporting this element of government overreach, because I know full well, even if every single member who is not signed up to this bill voted against it, the amendment still fails. Because Mr. Speaker's casting vote can't be to allow an amendment to succeed. The casting vote in a 12-12 would be to say the bill is as it is. And that worries me. That really worries me in legislative terms, because what it basically means, because we now have 10 ministers in a council of ministers, they can essentially govern without us. Parliamentary oversight, scrutiny becomes very much something to endure, not something that is a valuable part of the process. And so what I'm basically saying is vote whichever way you like, members, because it ain't going to matter. It's less likely to have an impact on other bills, because other bills will have fewer department members attached to them, but a bill like this that crosses departments actually will automatically, like I say, pass through the House. And that worries me. So I don't know what can be done about that. Honourable members, that is not an issue really for today. But I just needed to make it plain, I think, that this idea of backdating legislation, there are definitely cases where it's acceptable, but actually in a case like this where you're essentially erasing someone's ability to seek judicial recompense, I don't think that is an acceptable reason for government to push this through. And I really don't think having a government that automatically has a majority or a de facto majority in Parliament in the way that we do here is acceptable. We don't operate party politics. The government has no mandate. Everything is done by consensus, but actually consensus here basically is non-existent, and really that's something that I think we should take away and think about quite strongly, not just in respect of this debate, but bills and debates in Tynwald going forwards. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move.
I'm happy to second that, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Cannon.
Yep, so I rise actually to sort of tackle that head on, because actually what the member, former minister, has just alluded to has actually been the case for many, many years, Mr. Speaker, because even if there were 9 ministers and it was a cross-departmental bill, let's say the Treasury and Home Affairs, there still would have been 9 ministers, 2 former members of Treasury, plus at least 1 member of Home Affairs. So that actually there would have been 12 members anyway. So actually this isn't something new, so let's not get carried away that this is somehow some magic creation that's just been delivered because we currently have an additional minister, which is provided for in law, and we're simply, if members are so concerned about that, then they need to change the law. But we are certainly acting within the law, and the point that the minister has just stood up and sort of made a huge point about has actually been in existence for a considerable amount of time, and frankly, honourable members, have been operating on that basis for a long period of time.
Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to respond to the honourable member for Ramsey's points. And I'd also like to thank him because after second reading, I know he and a few others raised some queries on the bill and the provisions in Part 4, and I'd like to thank him and the others who've taken the time to engage with the department, visit the Fire and Rescue Service to work on the bill. On this particular matter, we have not reached a shared view, and I'd like to make very clear that actually, you know, the department does agree that this sort of retrospective provision should only be made in exceptional circumstances, but we do have the power to do that where it can be justified and where there is a good reason and purpose to clarify the law. The Department of Home Affairs considers that the circumstances here are exceptional, and we would wish for it to be recognised that the department is not proceeding with this simply to right a wrong. The previous decision to make charges for non-statutory service was based on a reasonable interpretation of the law around firefighting purposes. And I'm glad Mr Hooper's nodding and acknowledging that. I'm also glad that he has said in his remarks that the department has at all times acted in good faith. The department, to be very clear, sought advice from His Majesty's Attorney General, and the recognition is that Clause 11 is a useful clarification to draw a line under this issue, and retrospective legislation can be justified where its purpose is to provide clarification. In addition, consideration should be given to where there is a pressing social need for legislation, having regard to costs, disruption, waste of time and resources, noting that the estimated cost of false alarms in the UK in 2023 was £1 billion. The Isle of Man's estimated costs of attending false alarms are £99,553. So to be very clear, the department has acted in good faith throughout. This is not a question of not acting in line with the law. The department has been advised that it's acted in line with a reasonable interpretation of the law. And so the issue we are trying to deal with is the costs and time and resources of any challenge around that. And that is what we seek to negate. And I hope that honourable members will understand that this is an exceptional use of this power, but one which we believe is appropriate in the circumstances. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr Thomas.
Thank you. So I guess there's 2 points. The first one is that, as far as I remember, before 2014, there were 10 ministers, including the Chief Minister, but that hasn't been the situation since. And it's a separate point how many members of departments are unveiled into collective responsibility to guarantee a majority in the House of Keys. So that is an important point, very important point, but and the point was well made by Mr Hooper. The second point is retrospective use of law, which is something that needs to be strongly resisted. I mean, I had the privilege, the honour of taking through the limitation childhood abuse bill back in 2019, which was, going back decades in terms of retrospectivity, and that was a very important issue for real people with real sins and that have been committed against them, and it was done very properly in this place. I think Mr Hooper has made very powerfully the argument that we need to be very, very, very wary of that. At the time when we took through the limitation childhood abuse bill, there was an estimate of the maximum damage that could be done to the public purse. There was an estimate of who would have to pay in terms of the public purse. Does anybody who's still got to speak want to give any information about the risk that we're managing in terms of this retrospectivity and the sorts of cases that might arise? I've heard a very powerful argument from the Minister of Justice and Home Affairs that in actual fact they would win the cases because they've complied with the law in good faith, but there must have been an estimate of the risks involved for this law to be, for this potential law, this bill to be with us today. So is there anybody prepared to give us an estimate of what public purse we're putting beyond risk, what amount of public purse we're putting beyond risk, because it is an important principle that the law is made going forward, not going backwards, except in exceptional circumstances like historic sexual abuse.
Start summing up. I'll call Mr Hooper to sum up on his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I would like to thank the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs, actually, for her contribution, because I do welcome the engagement that the Department was happy to have with me on this one. I would say, though, that her language is very concise and very clear. They may very well have had legal advice saying that they acted within a reasonable interpretation. That is not the same as saying they would win a court case. That is the Attorney General saying, I think you've got a case to say you acted reasonably. A court may find differently, and that's the point I'm making here. It isn't the Attorney General is not the fountain of all knowledge about law on the Isle of Man. His word is not a pronouncement of fact. His word is a legal opinion. One opinion. And that's why we have the courts. We don't say we let the departments and government decide whether they've complied with the law or not. We don't let ministers decide on who's broken the law or not. That is a job for the courts. That is a job for our legal system, which is independent of government. And so whilst I absolutely take it as read that the department believes it acted reasonably and that the advice from the department's lawyer says you acted reasonably, and that is not the same as saying a court would find the same. And so from my perspective, I take on board everything that has been said by the honourable member, but I think the reality is that doesn't change the fact that by backdating a law like this, you are essentially overriding people's ability to go to the courts. In terms of the quantum, it would be nice to know how much money is actually being put at risk here. Are we talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of pounds? Now, I accept that in the grand scheme of things, a few £100,000 isn't a lot of money for the government. It very much is for the Department of Home Affairs, and I think that could be very much where we are seeing here. Is that the quantum? Is that the amount of money that we say, you know what, that's where we start telling people they've got no right to go to court anymore? That's a problem for me. Actually, you say it becomes a financial consideration. Your rights are there if it's only a small amount of money, but your rights are not there if it's a larger amount.
The honourable member.
Yes, of course.
I'm sure honourable members will appreciate it's incredibly difficult to put a figure on these things because you can't actually put a cost on any one individual case. I think the other thing, though, that it is quite important to note, though, is that in terms of trying to avoid any of these costs, which you're right, in a difficult and constrained financial environment, are difficult for any department to bear. But I think it's also worth noting that as well as seeking to put beyond doubt that we have acted in line with the law, it's that underlying legal power that also enabled the department to enter into agreements with people. So I think, you know, the extent of loss of rights and so on is very much negated by the fact that what has happened has been by agreement over the many years that the policy has been in place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the challenge I have here really is if the government was really sure of itself, it wouldn't be changing the law. We don't change the law when government does things and someone says, I think you are wrong. Government says, fine, we'll see you in tribunal, we'll see you in court. That's the way it is. Government doesn't say, no, I'm so convinced that I am absolutely right. I'm actually going to go and change the law to put it beyond doubt. That isn't the way we work. This should not be the way we work. I've made my case, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the amendment has lost before I've even started, but it was worth doing nonetheless.
Dr. Allinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Ramsey for his comments and questioning this. So he stated that consensus is non-existent. I don't agree. I think what we've tried to do with this bill is go out to honourable members to listen to their concerns, and the Minister for Justice and Home Affairs has already said that a significant amount of time has been spent by her officers explaining the current procedure, explaining the current policy, and saying why these changes are necessary to make it even more explicit that it can be implemented and enforced. This is not about revenue generation, this is about cost recovery, but also more sending out a signal in terms of some of the increased demands on the fire and rescue service and getting those into proportion, but also making those people who make extra demands that are above and beyond emergencies responsible and accountable for those. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move.
Put the question first, that amendment number 2 in the name of Mr. Hooper be agreed. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no.
No.
The noes have it. Aye. Division called. Six, 4, 17 against. The noes have it. The noes have it. Putting to you then clause 11 as printed. Those in favour, please say aye. 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 Against, no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Aye.
Division called.
Press the right one. It's the red one you need, Michelle.
Which one do I need? Shut up.
Green one you need it.
So 19 for, 4 against. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Turn to clause 12. Call on Dr. Allinson to move.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 12 substitutes Section 4 of the 1984 Act to incorporate the services listed in the new Schedule A1, which is later provided by Clause 14, to the services that the Department of Home Affairs has the power to charge for. Clause 12 also limits the way the Department of Home Affairs may use this power by clarifying whom the charge may be imposed on or recovered from, how the amount of the charge may be determined, and finally a discretionary power to not make a charge at all. The Department of Home Affairs has indicated that it intends to use this VIRES based on cost recovery and incentivising proper use of the Fire and Rescue Service, which will be set out and published in a published charging policy. In most cases, the charges will be pre-agreed and charged on a contractual basis. In the instance where a charge is issued after an event, the charges will be calculated in accordance with the published policy. Mr. Speaker, for noting, the Department of Home Affairs are proposing some amendments to Clause 12, which will add to the wording of the Act the duty to publish a charges policy. This policy will include a process of appeal for causation, which is the only time when a charge under Schedule 1A will be used without an agreed contract in place. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 12 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second.
Turn to Amendments 3 and 4 in the name of Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. These amendments are hopefully going to complement the amendment that is coming from the Honourable Minister for Home Affairs and Justice, number 5. The intention of these amendments is to require that where the Department does decide to charge and raise charging, it must be done in accordance with a charges policy. That charges policy, as a further amendment will hopefully make clear, will be produced by the Chief Fire Officer that must be drawn up and then published. The amendment at 4 also will give the Department the flexibility to prescribe by way of regulation the amounts of charges, which would ideally be done, again, in line with that policy that has been drawn up by the Department. I think this provides a good balance between giving the Department the flexibility it needs to design a charging structure that meets its needs, but also gives Tynwald, through the negative process, some ultimate oversight over what that charging really looks like. So I'm hoping these two amendments do complement the other amendment coming from Mrs. Poole-Wilson at number 5, and hopefully they'll be supported. Like I say, they're intended to work together as something of a package, and I'd be grateful for members' support. So I beg to move amendments number 3 and 4.
Mr. Thomas.
I beg to second. This is a very good amendment, very good discussion in the Bruce Suite where we talked about putting together a policy and charges, and welcome this amendment, and thank very much Mr. Hooper for following up and for the Department for engaging. Most importantly, I thank the Fire Service for modernising the way it thinks and moving more towards policies and a risk-based approach to all of these sorts of things.
Mrs. Poole-Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise to move amendment number 5 standing in my name. And as the Honourable Member for Ramsey has said, and as I alluded to earlier, I thank him for his engagement, and I do think that amendments 3 and 4 will work with amendment 5. Amendment number 5 supplements the provision at section 4 of the 1984 Act. It seeks to place on the face of the bill a means of transparency, assurance and operational efficiency. It does this in 2 ways, with a requirement to produce a charging policy and also the means of an appeal process where relevant. Mr. Speaker, subclauses 6 to 10 make provisions for the drawing up of a charging policy, which will set out not only how charges are calculated, imposed and recovered, but also how reviews are managed. When drafting the policy, there must be consultation with those most likely affected. To ensure complete transparency, the policy must set out the Department's methodology and the cost assumptions that underpin it, as well as the circumstances when charges may be imposed or recovered. The charging policy must be clear on how the Department will handle reviews when a decision has been made to charge without prior agreement. This only applies to charges under causation, as in both other circumstances outlined in Schedule A1, there would be a pre-agreed contract in place with the necessary terms and conditions. For such reviews, the charges policy will include information on timings, forms, time limits, and also what powers the Chief Fire Officer can exercise in determining a request for review, i.e. their ability to uphold or overturn a decision to charge. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the policy must be published, and for the avoidance of doubt, the new Clause 10 clarifies that this provision does not affect a person from pursuing challenge by way of dolience in relation to a charge. While the Department intended to operate in accordance with this amendment in exercising the powers of the bill as originally drafted, this amendment creates a statutory requirement to do so, and I hope that this provides assurance to members. Mr. Speaker, I beg that Amendment 5 to Clause 12 be moved in my name. Thank you.
Mr. Ashford.
I beg to second, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Mr. Glover.
A good reminder, Lord. Can I just place on record my thanks for the Chief Fire Officer, because I did have concerns here and he made himself available. I just want to place on record my thanks for that.
We move to summing up. Mrs. Paul Wilson, do you have anything to add? Mr. Hooper? Dr. Allenson? In which case, I put first the amendments number 3 and 4 in the name of Mr. Hooper. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Putting to you amendment number 5 in the name of Mrs. Paul Wilson. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, say no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Putting to you clause 12 as amended. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Now, honourable members, we still have some clauses left, but the clock is rapidly approaching 1. I noticed that there's no presentation or meeting that I'm aware of at lunchtime today. So unless anyone has any objections, I would like to vary our usual practice and instead of returning at 2:30, return at 2. But if any member has any issue with that, please speak now. In which case, I will suspend the sitting and we will resume at 2 o'clock. Thank you, honourable members.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Fast away. Good afternoon, honourable members.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker.
We continue consideration of the Treasury Miscellaneous Provisions Bill and we recommence at clause 13. I call on Dr. Allenson to move.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlucky for some. Mr. Speaker, clause 13 amends section 10 of the 1984 Act to include definitions of the terms used in the amended section 4 to describe whom a charge may be imposed on or recovered from. It also broadens the definition of firefighting purposes to include the services that the Isle of Man Fire and Rescue Service provides, but are not limited to the purpose of the extinction of fires and the protection of life and the property in the case of fire. Mr. Speaker, you will see from the order paper that the Minister for Home Affairs intends to move an amendment in respect of clause 13, which I understand will reduce the scope of those whose charges can be recoverable from in line with the Department's intended policy. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 13 stands part of the bill.
Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beg to second.
Now, turn to amendment 6 and Mrs. Paul Wilson to move.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment modifies section 10, the section 10 definition of connected persons. In essence, the Department is seeking to reduce the scope of people who can be pursued for payment of charges levied upon an individual under the 1984 Act. The original scope of this provision was wider than the Department intended to utilise, and so Amendment 6 substitutes the list of wider family members at clause 13 and reduces this scope to the parent or guardian of a person charged under Schedule A1. In practice, an individual would only be charged in relation to causation in accordance with this bill. In such instances, only that person or the legal guardian of a minor may be required to pay the charge. Such instances may include young people persistently setting fires that require fire and rescue service attendance, causing a risk or damage to properties, land, or themselves and others, and utilising resources and incurring costs to the fire service that ought to be deterred. I hope this amendment to align the provision to the intended policy and operational use provides members with clarity and assurance as to the extent of this provision. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move amendment number 6 to clause 13.
Mr. Ashford.
Beg to second, Mr. Speaker.
I'll put first amendment number 6 in the name of Mrs. Paul Wilson. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Putting to clause 13 as amended. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 14. Dr. Allenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 14 introduces a new Schedule A1 to the 1984 Act, which lists the services that the Department is being provided the explicit power to charge for. Schedule 1A is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 provides the definitions for the schedule, whilst Part 2 sets out the 3 different statutory bases upon which the charges can be made. The first service relates to attending events as a precautionary measure by prior agreement. This part gives powers to recover costs for the fire and rescue services being on standby for risk mitigations. The intention here is to enable the fire and rescue service to recover costs for supporting events as a precaution and not affecting their emergency response capability. Mr Speaker, the Minister for Home Affairs proposes to move an amendment which will serve to refine this charging provision and clarify the policy that emergency responses at such events would not be charged for. The second provision for which the Fire and Rescue Service may charge is for the attendance at false automatic fire alarm activations by prior agreement under a non-attendance policy. Unlike 999 calls, there is no statutory obligation for the Fire and Rescue Service to attend false automatic fire alarms. Fire and Rescue Service provide advice and support to those responsible for buildings where there are repeated and persistent false call-outs to the same property. If this advice and support does not reduce such false alarms, the Fire and Rescue Service may indicate that they will not attend future false activations. In this instance, the property owner or manager may choose to enter into an agreement with the Fire and Rescue Service to attend false activations, or they can manage the risks themselves. Any 999 calls will fall outside the scope of this provision, so if there is an alarm and a 999 call is made, there will be no charge for attendance. Furthermore, under such an agreement, no costs will be incurred for a response to overnight activations in sleeping accommodation. Finally, Schedule A1 makes provision in respect of the responding to emergency calls that have been caused by irresponsible and unsafe practices. This does not include accidents, but seeks to address situations such as repeated calls to burning that get out of control and or have not been reported in advance. The Fire and Rescue Service will still attend and deal with these situations, but a cost may be recovered subsequently in certain circumstances. Mr Speaker, I am aware that the Minister for Home Affairs will be moving amendments which will refine the scope and clarify this provision so that it aligns with the Department's intended policy in respect of charges and causation. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 14 stands part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
Now, to move amendments 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. Mrs Paul Wilson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Amendment number 7 substitutes paragraph 5 of part 2 of the new Schedule A1, charges in respect of attendance at events. The intention behind this substitution is to provide clarity as to the policy and a clear distinction between the Fire and Rescue Service's attendance at an event for precautionary and pre-arranged reasons and their attendance in response to an emergency, whether or not they are already in attendance as a precaution. Paragraph 5, subparagraph 1, provides the Fire and Rescue Service with the power to make a charge where they are attending as a precaution. Subparagraph 2 provides that an emergency response required during precautionary attendance does not qualify for a charge. Subparagraph 3 states that charges cannot be made in respect of providing an emergency response at an event. Turning to Amendments 8, 9, 10 and 11, these amendments are a package that facilitate the refinement of Clause 14 and relate specifically to Part 2 of Schedule A1. Paragraph 7, charges and causation. The Department recognised that the scope of Paragraph 7, charges and causation, was unintentionally wide in how it could have been interpreted. With this amendment, the Department proposes to make it clear that only those acts that are deliberate and reckless could be captured. There was and is no intention to capture any accidental fires. Mr Speaker, the Department also seeks to go further in limiting the power to charge under this provision and proposes to remove all domestic premises from the scope of this charging provision. Amendment number 8 is a drafting detail which will enable Amendment 11 to expand paragraph 7. Amendment 9 inserts the concept of recklessness for the purpose of limiting who can be captured. Amendment 10 carves out the exception for domestic premises. Finally, Amendment 11, which inserts subparagraph 1, provides a definition of reckless, and subparagraph 2 provides that any decisions to charge under this provision may be appealed to the Chief Fire Officer. The latter provision then speaks to the charges policy that I referred to earlier, which will contain the detail of that appeal process. Mr Speaker, I beg permission to move Amendments 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 to Clause 14.
Mr Ashford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second, and since this will probably be the last time I'll be on my feet, can I also place on record my thanks to the Chief Fire Officer for the very good meeting he had with me over my concerns that I expressed in second reading. His engagement was absolutely wonderful, and he reassured me around all of my concerns.
Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm quite happy to support these amendments and the clauses that will follow. I just wanted to make a comment, really. The Treasury Minister, when moving, talked about a lot of things which actually aren't in the bill. They're all matters of policy that the department is intending to apply. That's helpful, I think, telling us what the intention of the department is, but just to be clear, we're not being asked to approve the department's policy, and the clauses that are in front of us actually give the department the scope to change that policy if they decided to. So I think it isn't very helpful when clauses are being moved that what we're being told about is the intended policy of the department rather than what the clauses actually do. So I'd just like to stand a note of caution, really, members, to when the Minister is talking about they'll be charged with this but not for that. Actually, a lot of that isn't contained in the detail in front of us. A lot of that will sit in the policy document that comes forward from Home Affairs. So just need to be clear on what we're being asked to vote on here.
Mr Glover.
Guramaid, Lord. I was comfortable with this. Just some of the language that was used around there, and in terms of the emergency services as a whole, the word used was accident. So I'd just like the movers to define what they mean by that, because the police currently do not see anything now as an accident. There's always a cause behind it. So just that word accident has brought me to my feet.
Ms Edge.
Just listening to the honourable colleague from Marbury, Castham and Low, what if there was a fire following a traffic accident?
Right. In which case we now turn to opportunities to sum up. I call Mrs Paul Wilson first.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I will try and respond to the latter 2 points that were raised. To be very clear, the provision in the bill which we are voting on talks about a charge being imposed or recovered for the provision of firefighting services in response to report of a fire or explosion. That could happen in a whole range of circumstances. The critical issue is it would have to be an act of recklessness that led to that report. So, you know, we have excluded domestic premises, and many things will lead to problems, and that's why we've excluded domestic premises. I think people gave examples of leaving equipment switched on and forgetting about it. Accidents in a car, a momentary lack of paying attention could lead to an accident, but also so could dangerous driving or driving without due care and attention, which would then bring into play our criminal provisions. So it will obviously depend on every single circumstance. There's no question that the Fire and Rescue Service would attend. The issue is whether or not they would have the power to charge for that attendance if, having attended, it becomes clear that the cause of the fire or explosion should actually have been avoided because there was a lack, as Mr Thomas has said almost, when we're managing risk, there was a lack of due proper management, and indeed we've seen recklessness, which is quite a high bar, actually, I would suggest, honourable members. And again, this is simply to be able to recover costs only in appropriate circumstances. And to the point Mr Hooper has previously made, there will be an appeal mechanism in those circumstances to allow for someone where a charge is made to say, well, just a minute, it doesn't meet the reckless threshold. There are factors you really should have taken into account rather than levy a charge in this particular case. So I hope that brings some clarity to the very specific circumstances.
Would the Minister just... Can I just add up? Thank you very much. I'm just thinking with any sort of vehicle accident, for instance, there's insurance, so there is opportunity there for the fire brigade to be reimbursed. So, you know, any accident's an accident, but from what you're saying, they might not put a charge on it, but surely there is an opportunity for costs to be recovered if it's through an insurance.
Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think I would like to take us back to the detail of the bill. It is to allow for very, very specific circumstances where it is seen that through specific causation. And that does, because we've introduced wording around recklessness, this is a very narrow category of situations. It would be in the opinion of the senior fire officer attending as to whether or not the requirements in the statute had been met. There will be an appeal provision to the Chief Fire Officer, and as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, if at any point somebody feels like a charge has been wrongfully imposed out with the law, then there remains the power to pursue Dolian's proceedings. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The opportunity to sum up on the debate. Dr Allinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And, I'd like to thank the Honourable Minister for Justice and Home Affairs for that further explanation. What this bill is trying to do is inject responsibility and accountability. And actually, the ideal aim would be not to charge people, but some of this recklessness would be reduced, which puts the lives and welfare of the Fire and Rescue Service at significant risk at certain times. With that, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move.
So putting to honourable members First Amendments numbers 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 in the name of Mrs Poole-Wilson. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. And putting to you then clause 14 as amended. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 15, Dr Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 15 states that the clauses of this part of the bill will amend the Interpretation Act 2015. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 15 stand part of the bill.
Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beg to second.
Put the question that clause 15 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 16, Dr Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 16 amends Section 81 of the Interpretations Act 2015, which provides the Treasury, departments and statutory boards with a general fee power to set fees and duties. The amendment will limit the way the general fee power can be used. Instead of being used either way of an order or regulations, it is proposed that it only be used by way of an order. This change aims to streamline the legislative process by which the Treasury, departments and statutory boards can set and update their fees and duties. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 16 stands part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beg to second.
Put the question that clause 16 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 17, Dr Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 17 amends Section 84 of the Interpretations Act 2015, so it does not only apply to statutory documents made under the general fee power. As a result, the requirement for Treasury, departments and statutory boards to make available rate of fees and duties will now apply to all of their fees and duties, regardless of which legislative power was used to set and or update them. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 17 stand part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beg to second.
Now we have amendment number 12 in the name of Mr Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was brought to the Treasury's attention that the bill erroneously quoted Section 84 of the Interpretation Act 2015. Said section talks about the general fee power rather than the general fee making power. The proposed amendment would rectify this drafting mistake and would not affect in any way the policy or the way the proposed legislative measure will work. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move amendment to clause 17 standing in my name.
Mrs Corlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second.
Putting to you First Amendment number 12 in the name of Mr Smith then. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Putting to you clause 17 as amended. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 18, Dr Allinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clause 18 inserts a new Section 85A after Section 85 of the Interpretation Act 2015. By new subsections 85A 1 and 2, all fees may be set by order under Tynwald's negative procedure. As a result of these two changes alone, departments and statutory boards will be able to combine the majority of their fees into one statutory document annually. Section 85A1 would allow a department to choose whether to prescribe fees in an order or use the existing varies instead of an order. It therefore gives the department or statutory board flexibility according to the particular circumstance. By new Section 85A3, 4 and 5, departments and statutory boards will be able to increase fees automatically by reference to a published index such as CPI. If a department or statutory board chooses to do this, it must publish the list of new fees at least 14 days before the increase is to take effect and lay the list before Tynwald. The laying of the list before Tynwald and treating the laying as an order will enable the effective increase to be inserted into a consolidated version of the principal statutory document that first prescribed the fees. The combination of publishing the fee and updating the published legislation will guarantee transparency and avoid errors in the amounts due or paid by way of fees. New section 85(6)(a) would give the Treasury power to make regulations to amend any authorising legislation so that the legislation containing the fee-making power will provide for fees to be prescribed by order under the negative Tynwald procedure. This provision is for the purpose of clarity so that the new power is shown on the face of each enactment rather than just being contained in the Interpretation Act 2015. New section 85(6)(b) would allow the Treasury to remove a consultation requirement insofar as it relates to the prescribing of fees. However, under new section 85(a)(7), the Treasury would not exercise this power unless the department or statutory board that sets the fees in question agrees to the removal of the requirement. New section 85(a)(8) makes it clear that the powers to prescribe fees by order with the Tynwald negative procedure does not affect any other power in an enactment. New section 85(a) does not affect the duty of a department or statutory board to obtain the concurrence of the Treasury before prescribing a fee. It also does not interfere with the discretion of a department or statutory board to decide the fees it considers appropriate in all the circumstances. When deciding whether or not to automatically increase fees by reference to CPI, for example, the department would take into account the actual cost of doing the thing for which the fee is payable, which may have significantly decreased due to changes in technology, or conversely increased substantially due to additional regulatory requirements needing to be satisfied, or a fee may not have been increased for several years and therefore now requires a significant increase over a number of years to catch up with inflation. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that clause 18 stand part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beg to second.
So now to amendment number 13. I call Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another mistake was brought to the attention of the Treasury since the bill was introduced. A cross-reference issue this time. In the new section 85(a), subsection 5, incorrectly refers to a list published under subsection 4b. It should refer to a list published under subsection 4a instead, which is what this amendment would correct. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the amendment number 13 to clause 18, standing in my name. Thank you.
Call it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second.
Turn then to amendments 14 and 15 in the name of Mr. Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. These amendments very much go together. So the process that this new section, as I understand it, would allow the departments to go to Tynwald and say, I would like to increase all of my fees by CPI every year. Fair enough. So that then stays on the books until it is repealed. So every year, all the Treasury have to do then is publish a list once a year that says these are the uprated fees in line with that charging policy. That all sounds well and good. The problem is the actual act of uprating doesn't require any further Tynwald oversight. That list just gets published and laid before. There is no opportunity for Tynwald to say, hold on a second, we think those increases are unreasonable. And if you think about it in a short time scale, that's probably not something that's going to happen. If we pass a bill today that says, I don't know, your electricity price can go up by inflation every year, if that happens next year, it's not really too much of an issue. But think 5 or 10 years hence. So we're like sitting at the desk now and say, oh, these housing rents have gone up by inflation. What was inflation last year? 10%? Actually, where's the Tynwald oversight of that? It was a policy that we published a decade ago that said we can put rents up by CPI every year. There's no oversight of that. There's no sense check. And that actually is equally applicable where there are, say, errors in these lists that are published. There is no oversight to make sure that those things are picked up. And we've seen already there have been 2 corrections, which are typographical errors in this bill. You know, it's quite concerning that if we didn't have an oversight process, these things would slip through. And actually you would end up with incorrect charges being tabled, incorrect charges being charged, and then we all know what government does further down the line when they've done that. They'll backdate the law and say we never meant to do that in the first place. So I'm just quite nervous about the idea that after Tynwald signs something off once, that is it then for the foreseeable future. I think there needs to be some sort of sense check. And I accept the argument that's been put to me by Treasury officers that says the reason for doing this is to reduce the bureaucracy, so you don't want to have to go through a full Tynwald process and a full Tynwald debate every single year updating those documents, and I accept that. So the solution, I think, is the negative process. That requires that the document is still laid before Tynwald. The government has to do exactly the same amount of work that it always does, but it provides that Tynwald can then say, actually, we think we disagree with that. So there's no more work, no more bureaucracy for the government unless there is a problem, at which point Tynwald can step in and say, actually, we don't like this change, we don't like this uprating, so we are going to revoke or refuse to accept these increases. That, I think, is a sensible parliamentary check on this quite broad brush power that the Treasury are giving themselves. Like I say, I don't disagree with the nature of the power, I don't disagree with the approach that's being taken, but I do think there needs to be some oversight. So amendments 14 and 15 together simply change the labour for requirement in respect of this list of charging operating that happens to make that a negative process. And like I say, there'll be no additional bureaucracy on the government for this because the negative process is essentially a labour for unless there is a problem. Now, I accept the negative process is not perfect. It has its own problems and limitations, but it is, I think, better than a process that doesn't exist at all. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move amendments 14 and 15.
Thomas.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to second these very sensible amendments. First discussed in the Brule Suite. AG's chambers, senior drafters were there, and legal people have seen very, very sensible amendments. So pleased to second them and congratulate the mover of these amendments for taking them forward. Just one point on that is I think we did have an incident back in November 2023 with the Health Services Consultative Committee regulations when Keys voted to annul something, but Legislative Council got the vote wrong and voted against Keys, so they weren't annulled. But because the way that the primary legislation was drafted, it still went through, even though the democratically elected chamber ourselves had voted to annul something. So I do think we should perhaps use something like the Statute Law Revision Bill to make an amendment to the Legislation Act to capture this brilliant point, well argued now, across the piece, to allow for a combined vote if the branches are in disagreement. I think that would be eminently sensible to deal with the fact that we need to have a combined vote if the branch votes for something and the Legislative Council votes against it. So I'd hope Mr. Hooper could take forward that in such an efficient way and to use the Statute Law Revision Bill or another vehicle to make that equivalent amendment. In terms of the underlying clause, I've just got two points. One is a question and one is, well, both questions, but one's a sort of interpretive question. The first one is, does the Minister agree with me that with this sort of fees simplification, we should be able to get back to the position where fees and expectations about fees are back in the pink book as they were for a few years and then dropped out last year? And does he agree with me that's a good thing rather than a bad thing? And so we need to get to the situation where we have fees forward. The second point is, I just wondered what the status of the examples of indices are in this law. They're in italics, but I just wanted some clue about what goes on inside lawyers' minds. Does the fact that they're in italics mean that they're not actually part of the law? They're just examples. So, for instance, it doesn't say whether it's UK CPI or Isle of Man CPI. Most countries have lots of different types of CPI to do with different sectors. So I'm assuming that what's in the italics isn't actually in the law. It's just sort of helpful text to explain what an index is. So in a way, it's redundant because to me, this allows any index that's reputable to be used for this purpose. And I just wanted the Minister to put on hand side if that's the case. That all we're saying is a properly calculated, properly recognised official index is eligible as long as the department make the case for it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think I can speak to the amendment first and perhaps in summing up deal with the two questions by the Honourable Member, Mr. Thomas. I'd like to speak to this amendment. Mr. Hooper's amendment would reintroduce the need for an annual Tynwald approval in respect of any automatic fees increase that it has already previously agreed. this completely dilutes the policy intent to reduce bureaucracy and save considerable officer and parliamentary time. He talks about lack of oversight, but actually, if approved at the outset, the predictability of any automatic increase in line with the published index means that any member of Tynwald can challenge it prior to or as part of the uprating process. Given majority support, Tynwald will then be able to stop the automatic up rate of fees as it considers appropriate. And we are dealing very much with the oversight of Tynwald into a whole range of fees, some of which are quite significant, others in terms of fishing licences and dog licences are far less so. So in light of that, Treasury will not support this particular amendment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No other member wishes to speak. I'll give the opportunity to sum up and call first on Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm not sure what the Treasury Minister is talking about there, if I'm honest. The amendment specifically does not require an annual Tynwald approval. That is just woefully inaccurate. The negative process, by virtue of its process, is not an approval process. It's an annulment process. So it doesn't require an annual approval by Tynwald. I've no idea where the Treasury have got that from, but if that's the level of competence we're seeing, I'm even more nervous about handing these powers over to the Treasury without suitable oversight. That is quite worrying. The second question, really there, the Minister talks about that Tynwald has the ability to challenge and stop these uprating. Actually, they don't. At the outset, they do. So at the time that the regulation is made saying we're going to apply CPI forever and a day, that's the point Tynwald can say no. But if 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years later, Tynwald has no power to stop that. Yeah, we can have a debate that says Tynwald is of the opinion that Treasury shouldn't do this, and Treasury will, as Treasury often does, say thank you very much for your advice. We'll go away and do whatever we feel like. The reality is both of those statements made by the Treasury Minister are just wrong. They're not even close to being accurate statements. And that's exactly why this amendment is needed, because it is evident that Treasury don't understand the Tynwald processes. They don't understand the legislation they've written. And that's really worrying. So this amendment, quite simply, would allow a Tynwald backstop. That's the negative process. Mr Thomas is right, it isn't perfect. It could probably do with some tweaking, but the negative process in Tynwald is a backstop annulment provision. It is not an annual debate and an annual approval. It does not do those things. That is categorically wrong. And it introduces the ability of Tynwald to, at some point, if these fees, for whatever reason, are starting to grow out of proportion, bearing in mind these indices don't have to be reputable indices, they simply have to be published. So the Department of Home Affairs might decide that firefighting costs are 20% higher than CPI, not an unreasonable assumption to make. They could publish that indice and that could be the figure that they use forever and a day with no further Tynwald oversight. That is why a check and a balance is necessary. That is why this list shouldn't just be laid before Tynwald, it should require some sort of Tynwald oversight. The oversight I have opted for here is the very lowest level of Tynwald oversight, the negative process. So I don't see why this is an unreasonable thing to ask. The Treasury Minister has outlined his reasons for objecting, neither of which are actually valid in the context of what is actually being suggested here, and so I truly hope I can now count on his support, Mr Speaker.
Mr Smith. No? Dr Allinson.
Thank you very much. So summing up on the amendment, and if I can answer the questions for the Honourable Member, Mr Thomas, I completely agree with him that what is beneficial for everyone is publicity and transparency of fees. One of the issues previously with the Pink Book is that was anticipating changes in fees orders coming forward, and honourable members will be aware sometimes those didn't come forward for a whole range of reasons, often due to drafting time and parliamentary time. So by having these consolidated, we can be quite clear in terms of the fees coming forward, and hopefully bring those back in to the Pink Book and make sure that people on the Isle of Man know that the fees that are being charged for the provision of various services. In terms of the indices, he's quite right that CPI is used as an example. By convention, we increasingly use Manx CPI as opposed to the previous RPI, which had some issues in terms of its calculation. There may be certain departments that would prefer a slightly different indices, depending particularly for those departments that provide, for instance, energy or energy costs, which may be above or below CPI. And so what we're looking there is something that's relevant for that individual department or statutory board going forward. So with that, Mr Speaker, I beg to move.
To First Amendment number 13 in the name of Mr Smith. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Putting to you next amendments 14 and 15 in the name of Mr Hooper. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Aye.
The division called. Uh, 10 for, 12 against. The noes have it. The noes have it. Putting to you then clause 18 as amended by amendment 13 only. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no.
No.
Division called. I'm still waiting for some votes from Mrs Lord Brennan, Chief Minister. Thank you. 14 for, 8 against. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Turn to clause 19. Dr Allenson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Clause 19 amends Section 91 of the Interpretation Act 2015 so that any public body who have set and or updated a fee must publish a list of their fees. Currently, this is not compulsory. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that clause 19 stand part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
Put the question that clause 19 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Clause 20, Dr Allenson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Clause 20 repeals Section 102(3) of the Interpretation Act 2015 as a consequence of the changes made by this part. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that clause 20 stand part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
Put the question that clause 20 stand part of the bill. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. And clause 21 and the schedule, Dr Allenson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Clause 21 introduces the schedule. The schedule amends the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2018. Paragraph 2 amends Regulation 3 so that the definition of proper practices includes receipts and payments basis. This change provides the Treasury with the ability to direct a public body to prepare accounts on a receipts and payments basis should it be considered appropriate to do so. This reflects the change of wording in Section 4.1 of the Audit Act 2006 provided by Clause 3.3 of this bill, which acknowledges that accounts could be prepared on a receipts and payments basis. Paragraph 3 amends Schedule 1 to the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2018 where appropriate as a consequence of the change of wording in Section 4.1 of the Audit Act 2006 provided by Clause 3.3 of this bill. Paragraph 4 amends Schedule 2 of the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2018 where appropriate as a consequence of the change in wording in Section 4.1 of the Audit Act 2006 provided by Clause 3.3 of this bill. Paragraph 5 amends Schedule 3 to the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2018 where appropriate as a consequence of the change in wording of Section 4.1 of the Audit Act 2006 provided by Clause 3.3 of this bill. Mr Speaker, I beg to move that Clause 21 and the schedule stand part of the bill.
Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
Call on Mr Smith to move amendments number 16 and 17.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg permission to move amendments 16 and 17 together.
Carry on.
Mr Speaker, some minor drafting mistakes have been identified in the schedule. Firstly, the schedule incorrectly refers to Section 2, where it should be Section 21. Secondly, in the very last paragraph of the schedule, some parentheses have been forgotten when quoting the number of a paragraph. The proposed amendments would correct these small mistakes. Mr Speaker, I beg to move the amendments to the schedule standing in my name.
Mrs Corwett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to second.
Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. This is quite an unusual clause because we're amending a set of regulations to secondary law in a primary act. So I'd like to get some explanation as to why that's necessary. I would have thought the right thing to do would be pass the bill, get the bill having royal assent, and then bring regulations through Tynwald to update the Audit Regulations 2018 as a standard process. There's no delay in that. It's just the way we do things. Highly unusual to make the amendments to a piece of secondary legislation in a primary bill itself. Doesn't even make any sense. But the question I really need answering from the Treasury, not only why are we doing this very unusual thing, and if he's able to advise where this has been done before in such a way, that would be quite useful. But also, how is this going to be displayed presentationally? So normally when you're looking at regulations, you can find the bill, regulations all sit underneath it, and you can see all the various sets of regulations sitting underneath it on the legislation website, so anyone who's interested can actually follow the changes through. Now, I accept this is a bit of a nightmare with secondary sometimes because it doesn't replicate the entirety of the secondary piece of legislation. It simply adds in lines and words all over the place. It's a bit of a mess. But now we're going to further complicate this, because if I want to find the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2018, I will go to the website, I will find the 2018 regulations and open them, and they will be wrong because they've been amended by this bill. Now, there won't be a further set of regulations above that. I can click on to say, oh, this is how it's changed. It's going to be hidden somewhere in our primary legislation, in a bill that I have no idea how it's going to be presented to people. So really, from an understanding and a public understanding perspective, and anybody who's using these regulations, I'd like to get a better understanding from the Treasury as how is this actually going to be presented to the world. Will there be a comprehensive update of the audit regulations published somewhere that says this is what the most up-to-date regulations are? Will that be available on the legislation website, even though, strictly speaking, it's not a change to secondary? I just like to get a better understanding, really. So if you can answer why we're doing this very unusual thing in this way, it doesn't seem necessary. And secondly, how is he going to make sure that these changes actually flow through to the information that people use on a daily basis when they're accessing these regulations to ensure they're complying with the law?
Mr. Thomas.
I do think that's a very important point for the Treasury Minister to answer, Mr. Speaker. I do think any precedent for doing it this way is important to establish, and also to deal with the fact whether this now creates a precedent, for instance, exactly how we handle amendments to this part of the regulations. Is there some sort of precedent that we have to do it through primary legislation? I don't think that's the case, but I just think once you complicate things, they end up staying complicated forever. It's a bit like that with the indices. When the law is looked at in the future, by people thinking about setting fees orders, will they know that the italics bit isn't the law, and that they don't have to use CPI and RPI and go and ask for advice whether it's Manx CPI or English CPI, and that they can actually use any index that they want? Not unless we signal it to them, because it won't be interpreted by people in the AG's chambers. It will be interpreted by people in departments who are setting fees orders. And I also think that, I was disappointed. If I'm wrong, I'll eat my hat, as I was frustrated to do before and didn't have to do it. And I personally believe Mr. Hooper's opinion on the use of negative procedures under the Legislation Act rather than Dr. Allinson's. But it might be very confusing for historians in the future when they read ex cathedra pronouncement from the Treasury that's wrong when they're coming to see it. So I just wanted to use an immediate opportunity that I had to ask Treasury whether it reconsiders what was stated now, and actually asks Legislative Council to consider this at a later point, because we've obviously missed the opportunity now. But to me, keeping something correct in the legislation procedure, in the Legislation Act, and how valuable negative procedure is, I do think that's so important. I do think it might be a question of not forcing Thomas to eat his hat. It might be a question of eating a bit of humble pie and actually asking Legislative Council to revisit this, because I think Mr. Hooper made the case very persuasively, and it would be good to keep this simple rather than complex and wrong.
Mr. Smith to reply to the debate on the amendment.
I don't think nothing to add. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call on Dr. Allinson to reply to the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the two honourable members for their contributions. I don't think this does create a precedent. It is indeed unusual for a piece of primary legislation to amend the secondary legislation. However, it was deemed necessary to do so in this case to ensure consistency between the act that is being amended and its subordinate legislation. The amendment made to the Audit Act 2006 by Clause 3.3 in Part 2 of the Bill aims to resolve a very discrete issue, the compliance of the statutory wording to be used by inspectors undertaking an assurance review or examination of accounts under the Audit Act 2006 with the applicable professional standards. This wording set in the Act is repeated within the Accounts and Audit Regulations 2018, and it was therefore agreed that the change would be reflected in the regulations a form of consequential amendment, if you'd like to see it that way. In terms of the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper's comments about trying to get a comprehensive update, I've been assured by officers in Treasury that this will be updated on the website with the changes in terms of the legislation, so it will be quite clear to all involved that those changes have taken place, and certainly advice was sought from the Attorney General's chambers on the feasibility of this operation, and it was made possible because the changes to the regulations are consequential to the changes made to the acts they are made under. With that, Mr Speaker, I beg to move.
Putting to you first Amendments 16 and 17 in the name of Mr Smith. Those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against no? The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Putting to you then that clause 21 and the schedule stand part of the bill. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against no? The ayes have it. The ayes have it. That concludes consideration of the Treasury Miscellaneous Provisions Bill today, and indeed the order paper for this week. The House will stand adjourned until our next sitting next Tuesday, 10th, in Tynwald Court. Thank you, Honourable Members.